Chapter 2387. The cultivator who sacrificed himself had now turned into countless fragments and fused with the giant black tower. The structure of these countless fragments was naturally different from the state of the countless fragments that Luo Fan was currently in during the sixth tribulation. After all, the sixth calamity split Luo Fan into countless fragments to deal with him, to test him, and even to erase him. However, Luo Fan turned the cultivator who sacrificed himself into countless fragments to give him a chance to recover. These two completely different purposes naturally caused the structure of the two to be completely different. At this moment, after the fragments that the cultivator turned into fused with the giant black tower, they turned into a clear stream that didn't fuse with the boundless baleful aura. This clear flow was incompatible with the baleful aura. However, when the baleful aura turned into a world, it would be greatly attracted and enter the world. It would enter the missions obtained by the creatures that entered the Black Tower, and it would continue to absorb nutrients from their missions. This way, no matter what existence entered the giant Black Tower, as long as they wanted to escape and obtain benefits, they could only complete the missions. Once the mission was completed, a portion of the nutrients from the mission would be absorbed by the cultivator's fragment. In the end, the cultivator's fragment would be repaired, and the damage that the cultivator had suffered from self-sacrifice would slowly recover. It was just like what was happening in the world that Duan Shi was in at this moment. At this moment, the world that Duan Shi was in also had the cultivator's fragment. Moreover, there were quite a lot of fragments. These fragments had fused with every aspect of the world, almost carrying out all the rules of the world. This way, as long as the world was saved and the fate of destruction was reversed, or even if the world was promoted, the negative state of the fragments would also be reversed, and the fragments would be restored. This was the reward that Luo Fan gave to the cultivator at this moment. Of course, the cultivator could give rewards, but the black mist sealed by the cultivator that could annihilate all living beings in this world was clearly not the same. At this moment, the black mist had been refined by the giant black tower itself. Apart from a very small amount that entered the world with the cultivator's fragments to resist the cultivator's fragments, most of the black mist had completely fused with the black tower and become a part of it. It could be said that although the black mist had the power to completely destroy all the creatures in the world, as time passed, the black mist would be destroyed and erased at the same time as the cultivator's fragments were saved. This was also the arrangement that Luo Fan had arranged for the cultivator to sacrifice himself. Luo Fan watched as the cultivator turned into countless fragments and began to merge with the broken world. Most of the sealed black fog was digested, with only a small portion entering the world along with the fragments. Luo Fan knew that his arrangements had succeeded. At this moment, he no longer cared about the giant black tower. He withdrew his mind and fused with the light of heaven and earth again, using the light of heaven and earth to control the entire world. The various methods that he had used just now seemed very amazing and contained endless principles and mysteries, but in the end, he had only used the light of heaven and earth to activate it, and it was only a very small portion of the world's power. If he could really control the world as he pleased like the will of heaven and earth back then, everything that happened before would not have happened at all. At that time, he only needed a single thought, to completely resolve the crisis from before. Even the creatures in this part of the world wouldn't feel anything out of the ordinary. After realizing this, how could Luo Fan still ignore the light of heaven and earth's control over the world? However, the action just now had given him a better understanding of the use of the will of heaven and earth, allowing him to have a deeper understanding of the operating rules of the entire world. At this moment, using the light of heaven and earth to control the world was much easier and faster than before. Although it was impossible to end the process of controlling the world in a short period of time, it was definitely possible to speed up the process by a large margin. As Luo Fan entered a state of cultivation again, more and more cultivators in the world suddenly felt some kind of summoning from the center of the world. The more powerful the cultivator, the more they could not resist this summoning. They could not help but rush toward the center of the world. Just like that, in just a few days, countless powerful cultivators gathered around the giant black tower. After these cultivators arrived, they were shocked by the existence of the giant black tower. All of them looked at the giant black tower as if they had seen the great path. Their eyes were filled with passion, excitement, and admiration. So cultivation can reach this step. The same thought appeared in the hearts of many cultivators at this moment. With this thought in mind, countless living beings regained their great ambitions and began to aspire to climb to a higher peak of cultivation. Just as they were shocked, waves of aura appeared from the giant black tower and swept toward the cultivators. They wrapped around the cultivators and sent them into the giant black tower. These auras didn't choose creatures at random. Instead, they chose from the crowd of cultivators according to some strange rules. Therefore, the creatures that were wrapped around the giant black tower were not the ones that were closer to the tower. Most of them were in the center, living beings that were neither too far nor too close to the giant tower. The moment these creatures were sent into the giant black tower, they were thrown into some strange world. Their conditions were different as well. Some lost their power completely, some had their power greatly increased, some had their intelligence blinded, and some had their intelligence greatly increased. In short, everyone had their own experiences, their own characteristics, and their own differences. Their missions were also different from one another. Some were to save the world, some were to destroy the world, some were to kill some existences, some were to save some existences, some were to complete some kind of program. There were all kinds of them, and they were all strange. Facing these changes, the cultivators should have panicked, but the strange thing was that after entering the world, they all felt that this was how it should be. There was no panic at all. Of course, one of the reasons was that these cultivators were all extraordinary, and their control over their minds had reached an unimaginable height. However, the main reason was because of the laws of the Black Tower. In other words, it was the existence of the Black Tower that calmed the various emotions of fear that should have arisen in their hearts. In the face of this situation, the many cultivators outside the Black Tower were left dumbfounded. But soon, they all received all kinds of information from the giant Black Tower. This information told them the essence of the giant Black Tower, and it also told them the significance of entering the giant Black Tower and the benefits they could obtain. After receiving this information, even a cultivator with no sense of responsibility would not be able to muster any thoughts of resistance. After all, they could still remember how terrifying the previous calamity was. Even now, they were still extremely afraid of the terror that could destroy the world. At this moment, they knew that the responsibility of the giant Black Tower was to eliminate the boundless baleful aura in the world. How could they object? Not to mention, after eliminating a certain amount of baleful aura, they could also obtain many benefits. They might even be able to improve their cultivation. This was a great temptation. It could be said that with this temptation, even if the responsibility of eliminating baleful aura did not exist, most of them would be willing to take the risk. As for the giant Black Tower's selection of cultivators, there was no need to mention it. The density of the baleful aura gathered by the giant Black Tower had reached a shocking level. Even with the operation of the giant Black Tower, such a dense baleful aura was not something an ordinary cultivator could endure. If one did not meet certain conditions, such as lacking willpower and cultivation, then entering the tower might just add to the baleful aura or eliminate it. Therefore, the giant Black Tower was naturally very cautious when it came to selecting cultivators. Of course, this was only temporary. When the operation of the giant Black Tower stabilized and the elimination of baleful aura was on the right track, the standard of cultivators who could enter the giant Black Tower would naturally be greatly reduced. At that time, getting rid of the giant black tower would become the most important task for all cultivators and even all living beings in this world. While the cultivators were digesting the information from the Black Pagoda, the time that the cultivators had experienced inside the Black Pagoda had already been measured in the tens of millions of years. After such a long period of time, Duan Shi had almost exhausted all of his wisdom. He used the means of controlling all living beings to solve the hidden danger of the world he had entered, saving the world from the brink of destruction. He even improved the world greatly, making it several times stronger than before. I finally succeeded. After spending tens of thousands of lifetimes, I've almost calculated the will of the people and the will of the heavens, and I've finally saved this world from the brink of extinction. Duan Shi's heart was filled with an indescribable sense of achievement as he looked at the world that was gradually emitting an inexplicable golden light. With the body, power, and wisdom of an ordinary person, he had saved the entire world. Even if it took him tens of millions of years, it was still an extremely amazing achievement. Before this, no matter how wild Duan Shi's imagination was, he would never have thought that he could achieve this. At this moment there were countless legends about him everywhere in this world. Among them, it was either his current life or one of his previous lives. It could be said that most of his reincarnations were lost in the legends due to various reasons. However, the legends that were passed down, which even the powerhouses of this world could not erase, were already enough to become a great historical masterpiece of this world. The moment this world was completely saved, all the living beings in this world suddenly understood everything. Everything that Duan Shi had done in the previous reincarnations appeared in their hearts, allowing them to suddenly understand the price that a certain powerhouse had paid to save this world. This made many living beings feel extremely grateful. For a time, indescribable mental energy gathered toward Duan Shi from all directions. The mental energy directly broke through the seal that this world had on Duan Shi, allowing Duan Shi's body, strength, and thinking that had always been at the level of an ordinary person to break through the limits of an ordinary person and began to climb to a height that ordinary living beings could not imagine. In just a few breaths' time, he had become an itinerant immortal again, becoming an existence that had surpassed the shackles of lifespan. Then, in just a few breaths' time, he broke through the three earthly immortal realms and stepped into the primordial pure yang realm. Then, it was the innate zenith luo, followed by the sage-to-be, false saint and false saint. In the end, when he was restored to his peak of the level of a desperado, the ascension did not stop. Instead, it continued to urge his mind to ascend, urging his power to ascend, urging his cultivation realm to ascend, and continuing to ascend. All kinds of indescribable enlightenment surged in his heart at this moment. All the efforts that he had made in the state of an ordinary person in the past tens of millions of years gushed out from the depths of his heart in the blink of an eye, making him feel like he had experienced everything in the past tens of millions of years again in an instant. Along with this change, a strange cracking sound rang in his heart. Then, his cultivation realm broke through the shackles of a desperator and stepped into a brand new realm that was worlds apart from his previous realm. The realm of a supreme emperor. In just a few breaths' time, he had already reached a level where he could easily overlook his previous self. With a glance, all the mysteries of this world were reflected in his eyes. A feeling of omnipotence, omniscience, and omniscience emerged from the bottom of his heart. This feeling was like he had suddenly become a true saint. "I've finally broken through," Duan Shi murmured, his heart filled with excitement. At the same time, a hint of clarity began to emerge from the bottom of his heart, directly washing away the feeling of omnipotence, omniscience, and omniscience. Chapter 2388. As Duan Shi broke through, the entire Black Tower suddenly lit up slightly. It was as if some kind of extremely dazzling light had suddenly erupted from the depths of the tower. However, this slight light only lasted for a short while. In the blink of an eye, the light had completely disappeared, and was once again drowned by the black of the black tower. It felt as if some kind of light wanted to completely light up the black tower, but it was simply unable to do so. In the end, it was completely devoured by the black of the black tower. Of course, this change was not without its merit. At the very least, at this moment, the many cultivators around the giant tower suddenly felt some kind of indescribable hope emerging from the depths of their hearts. In fact, it felt as if the entire world seemed to have undergone some kind of subtle change, as if an unimaginable burden had suddenly been lifted a little. This is a part of the evil aura that was purified by a powerhouse? Similar thoughts echoed in the hearts of many cultivators at this moment, causing them to show even more hope. A powerhouse had completed the mission, which meant that the mission could be completed. It also meant that the possibility of them obtaining benefits after entering the tower was much greater than what they had imagined. Just at this moment, a figure slowly walked out from the gigantic pagoda. This figure had 3 eyes and 4 elbows, and his expression was calm and indifferent. His entire body was surrounded by an otherworldly charm that was unimaginable to all cultivators. As he stood there, although he was still tiny to the point of being negligible when compared to the Black Tower, his existence also gave many cultivators the feeling that they were facing some sort of supreme principle. Most of the cultivators were extremely unfamiliar with this creature. Only a few cultivators who were older and had a higher cultivation realm could not help but exclaim at this moment, "Alliance Master?" That's right. The person who walked out of the giant Black Tower was Duan Shi, the powerful existence that was respected as the Alliance Master in the Supreme Alliance. When Duan Shi heard the movements around him, he swept his gaze around and saw all the cultivators around him. With a jolt of his heart, he clearly understood everything that had happened after he entered the Black Tower. At this moment, he didn't care about the thoughts of the cultivators who recognized him. He turned around and walked back into the giant Black Tower to start a new round of missions. After all, this Black Pagoda was designed to purify all karma and baleful chi in this world, not to target all cultivators in this world. Therefore, the rules of the Black Tower gave the cultivators a chance to catch their breath. Once a cultivator was able to complete a task, he would gain a long period of freedom. He could arrange his own affairs and enjoy the various conveniences brought about by his strength. The next time he met the requirements of being forcefully summoned, only then would he be forcefully pulled into the giant Black Tower to complete the mission. However, this was only a basic principle. If a cultivator had an extreme thirst for power, had an incomparably noble spirit of devotion, or had nothing else to do, then they could choose to enter the giant tower at any time after leaving this giant tower. Just like Duan Jie's choice, after all, to Duan Shi, he did not have the desire to enjoy the various conveniences that came with his cultivation. On the contrary, he yearned for cultivation more. It was obvious that entering the giant tower to complete the mission was a form of cultivation for him. Therefore, at this time, as soon as he left the giant tower, he turned around and entered the giant tower again to start the next mission. As expected of the Alliance Master, he started another mission right after the purification. The cultivators who recognized Duan Shi could not help but show admiration at this moment. Obviously, they were extremely impressed by Duan Shi's choice. Not all cultivators had the courage to accept all kinds of challenges and endure all kinds of hardships. After the giant tower was purified a little, it seemed to have lowered the requirements of the cultivators. At this time, the number of cultivators that were pulled into the giant tower began to increase, and the frequency was also increasing. In just a few breaths, there was only a small portion of the original living beings around the giant tower. At this time, the inside of the giant tower was densely packed with countless worlds, spacetimes, and worlds. These worlds, and spacetimes were strange, and there were cultivators in them at this time. Of course, not every heaven and earth, every world, and every stretch of spacetime only had one cultivator. In fact, there were many cultivators who entered a certain world, or a certain space-time together to complete the mission in that space-time together due to their lack of strength or wisdom. Due to such changes, the cultivators inside began to unknowingly form one organization after another. Many cultivators interacted with each other more and more, and in the end, they even took the initiative to cooperate with each other to complete one mission after another. The flow of time in the world, and space-time inside the giant tower was different. However, there was one thing in common, and that was the flow of time in the outside world was far faster than the flow of time in the outside world by tens of millions of times. Among them, the flow of time was so fast that only a breath of time in the outside world had passed hundreds of millions of years in the outside world. Due to such changes, the ecology inside the giant tower matured quickly. After a few months in the outside world, when all the cultivators gathered around the giant tower had entered the tower, the ecology inside the giant tower had become extremely perfect. Organizations that latecomers had never seen before, nor could they imagine, had tightly bound them like a spider web, forcing them to follow the rules set by the forerunners, and even endure all kinds of exploitation from the forerunners. The rewards of the missions were strange, but they did not only increase one's cultivation realm. In fact, the rewards of increasing one's cultivation realm could only be encountered by cultivators who completed extremely difficult missions with shocking completion rate. Among them, for Duan Shi, he had completed these missions almost every time. Therefore, in the past few months, he had completed thousands of missions, and each mission required at least tens of millions of years to complete. Moreover, he had completed each mission almost perfectly. Because of this, he had obtained thousands of chances to increase his cultivation realm in the past few months. However, it was obvious that increasing one's cultivation realm was not that simple. Even though he had obtained so many chances to increase his cultivation realm, in the end, he was still at the initial stage of the Supreme Emperor stage. He was still extremely far away from the peak of the Level 1 Supreme Emperor stage, let alone the Supreme Emperor stage of a higher level. However, even if that was the case, his current strength could be said to be a world of difference compared to a few months ago. One should know that increasing one's cultivation realm by thousands of times was not just an illusion. It seemed like he was improving so slowly now, but it was only because the gap between each level of the Supreme Emperor stage was too huge. However, it was not to say that the thousands of times of increase were useless. Because of this kind of increase, Duan Shi had unknowingly become a legend inside the giant tower. Although there was no public space inside the giant tower, there was no public place for the many cultivators to communicate with each other. However, just by word of mouth and the cooperation between different cultivators in the missions, it was enough for information to circulate, allowing the cultivators to have a clear understanding of the giant tower as a whole. Therefore, as long as Duan Shi did not always come and go alone, his information would spread sooner or later, and all the cultivators would know about it. Therefore, in just a few months, Duan Shi had already stood at the peak of the giant tower's ecosystem, becoming the target of admiration and envy for every cultivator who stepped into the giant tower. The giant tower was attractive to all living beings. As long as one's strength had reached a certain level, one would be able to feel the giant tower's call. Therefore, even though the first batch of cultivators had already entered the giant tower, it did not mean that the surroundings of the giant tower were empty. As a matter of fact, there were still countless cultivators and living beings gathering toward the giant tower from all directions at every moment. Most of them came with the living beings that were summoned. The number of living beings that were summoned was actually not that many. At least, they did not make up the majority of the living beings. Faced with such a situation, the barren surroundings of the giant tower gradually changed. One city after another began to be built around the giant tower. This was because the giant tower was just too big. Therefore, even the cities were not enough to completely occupy the surroundings of the giant tower. As a result, countries and civilizations began to take shape. The cities continued to fight and assimilate, eventually forming one nation after another. One civilization after another began to grow around the huge tower, protecting it. Or rather, they began to exploit the cultivators that gathered around the tower. In just a few hundred years, the surroundings of the giant tower had truly become the center of the entire world. It was the same whether it was the geographical location or the location of the civilization. The changes even affected the entire world, affecting the newly born civilizations in the entire world and gradually drawing closer to the civilizations around the giant tower. The civilizations around the giant tower were naturally affected by the giant tower. Not only did the system completely match the changes of the giant tower, but the various materials, technologies, and cultures were also closely connected to the giant tower. After all, the cultivators that came out of the giant tower would first come into contact with the civilizations around the giant tower. Such contact was enough for them to leave traces of the various things inside the giant tower in these civilizations, thereby changing these civilizations. Since these civilizations were the center of the entire world, they would naturally continue to radiate outwards and gradually affect all the civilizations in the entire world, causing the civilizations in the entire world to move closer to the civilizations around the giant tower. The changes that lasted for hundreds of years completely changed the appearance of the entire world. It made the entire world look like a completely different world from before the calamity. If there were such changes on the outside, then the changes in the interior of the giant tower would only be greater. After all, the flow of time inside the giant tower was not comparable to the outside world. The long passage of time was enough to change everything. Even if the people inside the giant tower were almost all powerful cultivators, it was still the same. Hundreds of years in the outside world were tens of millions of years for the cultivators inside, even for those who had the least experience in the world. For those who often experienced the flow of time that was even longer, this period of time was already more than 1 trillion years. In such a long period of time, even the most basic and simplest rules were enough to make a huge difference. Moreover, the rules inside the giant tower were already quite complicated. The various rules were enough to tightly bind the latecomers like a spider web. Among them, the biggest change inside the giant tower was none other than the fact that the giant tower had finally formed a public space out of thin air after countless efforts by countless cultivators. It was a public space that connected all the worlds that existed in the past, the present, and the future of this giant tower. It was a space that connected all the worlds, all the heavens and earth, and all the space-time. This public space was not only the transit point for all the worlds, but also the place where all the cultivators appeared after entering the giant tower for the first time. It was also the last place where all the cultivators stayed before leaving the giant tower. The existence of this public space did not come from the creator of the giant tower, Luo Fan. In fact, before the giant tower was built, Luo Fan did not even think that such a public space would exist. The reason why this public space had appeared was completely due to the will of the many cultivators who entered the giant tower. It could also be said that this was the result of the operation of the giant tower's own rules. Opening a world inside the giant tower was not an easy task for any cultivator. However, it was not impossible. After all, there were too many cultivators who entered the giant tower, and the various powers inside were too rich. It was not strange for cultivators to make the impossible possible and open up a world inside the giant tower. However, just because there was a chance to open up a world did not mean that it would be easy for the giant tower to recognize the world and turn it into a public space. In this public space, there was a statue in the center of the giant tower ever since it was recognized by the giant tower. It was an incomparably tall and majestic human statue that was filled with boundless mercy and compassion. Chapter 2389. This powerhouse had made a wish to create a public space that could exist for a short period of time after completing an extremely difficult mission. For this, not only had he sacrificed the reward of the mission, but he had also cleared all the rewards from the previous hundreds of missions. As a result, not only did his cultivation not increase, but it was also weakened. This caused him to constantly struggle on the line between life and death in the next dozens of missions. Even now, he still hadn't escaped from the line between life and death. As a result, he hadn't even come to this public space that he had made many times. It could be said that without this powerhouse's sacrifice, this public space wouldn't have existed. Even if that powerhouse had created it in the end, it was only a temporary public space. As for why this public space could go from a temporary existence to a permanent one, and even become the transfer point for all mission worlds, spacetime, and the last place for cultivators to leave this giant tower, it was because many powerhouses who had received the public space's grace had strengthened it again and again, made wishes again and again, and made sacrifices again and again. However, it was obvious that apart from that powerhouse, even if other cultivators made wishes and made sacrifices, the losses they suffered were far less than that powerhouse. It was also because of this that there was a huge statue of that powerhouse in the center of this public space. This represented the gratitude of all living beings who had received the public space's grace towards that powerhouse. In fact, the powerhouse was able to struggle on the line between life and death so many times and still survive again and again because of the cultivators' gratitude towards that powerhouse. It was their gratitude that protected that powerhouse, allowing that powerhouse to keep his life even in the worst situation. From a certain point of view, the powerhouse's initial sacrifice was not for nothing. At the very least, before he was forgotten by the world, his life would be guaranteed. Of course, this kind of reward was clearly not what that powerhouse could have imagined. After so many years of development, this public space had long become extremely complicated and tight. It had even been divided into many regions, and many living beings had fixed the passageways to different worlds. The birth and formation of a world did not have any fixed rules. It could be said that it was completely derived from the conditions of living beings. In other words, this kind of division of regions and fixed passageways leading to different worlds was originally impossible. However, there were simply too many cultivators who had entered the giant tower, and the wisdom of those cultivators was simply too profound and powerful. After the public space appeared, they experimented again and again, and used their magical powers to change the public space. In the end, they turned the impossible into the possible, and the worlds connected to each area were mostly fixed. This kind of stability was naturally completely different from the development of that world that was completely fixed. After all, it was the laws of the tower itself. It was not something that could be easily changed. This kind of stability, however, was a complete stability in nature. In other words, the world that one could enter from a certain region was a random world that met a certain standard, and this standard was their fixed result. The random result was the result of the operation of the laws of the giant tower itself. This kind of stability was naturally far from enough for ordinary living beings. After all, with the abilities of ordinary living beings, they could not completely determine the specific appearance of these worlds, and it would be difficult for them to completely determine their gains. However, for powerful cultivators, determining a certain standard was already enough. This was because as long as they could determine a certain standard, they would definitely be able to obtain the gains they wanted if they acted according to that standard. It could be said that the existence and development of the public space had completely changed the situation inside the giant tower. It made the giant tower more like a dangerous place of adventure, and it was no longer a place of trial that was completely hopeless like before. It was also because of the existence of this public space that the survival rate of living beings was much higher than at the beginning. After all, the existence of the public space had increased the communication between living beings who entered the giant tower by countless times. and this increase in communication allowed the experience of the pioneers to be more accepted by the latecomers. In this way, it could naturally greatly increase the survival rate of the latecomers. On this day, when the giant tower's 1,000 years of existence was about to arrive, finally, a strange change happened to the giant tower. Due to the hard work of the living beings, the color of the entire giant tower finally changed a little permanently compared to the change that erupted from the depths of the giant tower and illuminated the giant tower every time a living being completed a certain task. The degree of change that the giant tower experienced now was actually far from that instantaneous change. However, compared to the instantaneous change in the giant tower's color back then, the change this time was permanent. It was a change that would never change back no matter how long time passed and no matter how the world changed. One could imagine the magnitude of this change. When the powerhouses who were studying the giant tower in the outside world saw this change for the first time, they were all shocked. This was the first permanent change that had happened to the giant tower since its birth. The living beings who were studying the giant tower could not be more clear about what this change meant. In an instant, they all spread the news, and all of them became extremely excited. They've already purified a part of the giant tower perfectly. The baleful aura in the entire world has been permanently reduced by a part. That's great. That's great. At this moment, these cries constantly echoed in the many civilizations around this giant tower. The entire world seemed to have entered a carnival at this moment. However, just as everyone was celebrating, a new change appeared in the giant tower. All of a sudden, countless strange auras emerged from the giant tower and began to spread in all directions. This aura was emitted every time the giant tower took the initiative to pull living beings into it. Even the stupidest fool knew what the existence of this aura represented. In an instant, all the originally fanatical celebrations in the area enveloped by this aura came to a halt. It felt as if everyone's bodies and throats were directly choked by an invisible force. The aura emitted from the giant tower had already covered the many civilizations around the giant tower in the blink of an eye, completely enveloping every region of these civilizations. Then, the aura slightly trembled, and nearly 80% of the living beings in this area were suddenly enveloped by the aura. In the blink of an eye, they had already been sucked into the giant tower and disappeared without a trace. And after 80% of the living beings were sucked into the giant tower, there were no more movements from the giant tower. Apart from the perpetual change in color, there seemed to be no difference from the past 1,000 years. After a long time, the remaining 20% of the living beings in the surrounding civilizations fled in panic, crying incessantly. They began to search in their civilizations, searching for how many people were taken away, searching for their relatives and friends, and how many people could remain. In the end, when they confirmed that almost 80% of their relatives and friends had disappeared, the cries became even more mournful, and the fear became even more intense. After that, these civilizations began to collapse, and those living beings used various means to leave these civilizations, moving away from the giant tower. Clearly, they no longer dared to linger around the huge tower after what had happened earlier. In just a few short months, the many civilizations around the giant tower had completely turned into ruins. Even though there were extremely few living beings that were still waiting for the living beings to escape from the giant tower, there were only a few of them. Compared to the vast area occupied by these civilizations, they seemed so insignificant. The center of this world's civilization and culture had become an ancient ruin in just a few short months, a forbidden place for all living beings. On this day, a cultivator completed a certain mission and escaped from the giant tower. When he saw the changes in the many civilizations around the giant tower, he suddenly revealed a shocked and enlightened expression. No wonder there are so many people these days. It turns out that they are the living beings of these civilizations. After sighing with emotion, he turned to look at the giant tower behind him with a respectful and fearful expression. He had stayed in this giant tower for over 100 years, so he had a good understanding of the situation around the giant tower and the situation around it. At this moment, just by looking at the changes in the color of the giant tower, he knew what exactly was going on. The cultivators who worked hard to carry out missions in the giant tower must have finally achieved the achievement of permanently fixing the purification results of the giant tower after repeated efforts. In the end, the giant tower's standards for the living beings who entered it were greatly reduced. This reduction allowed the countless living beings in the surrounding civilizations who originally did not meet the standards to enter the giant tower to meet the standard. In addition, they stopped at the edge of the giant tower. In the eyes of the giant tower, they were simply waiting to enter the giant tower to carry out missions and help the giant tower purify itself, or in other words, help the world purify the endless baleful aura. In this case, how could the giant tower be polite to these living beings? Of course, it would directly pull these countless living beings into the giant tower. It seems that their guess back then was correct. There is indeed a great hidden danger in building a civilization around this giant tower. It's a pity that even they don't agree with this guess, which is why they didn't persist at all, and most of them were even sucked into the giant tower at this moment. As this thought flashed through the cultivator's mind, he had already landed in the cave abode he had built in a certain civilization. In other words, he had landed in the residence that he had built in a certain civilization. The them that he was talking about were some so-called researchers that he had heard of before entering this giant tower. As the population grew, there were naturally all sorts of theories and all sorts of results that kept appearing. It was the same even for the research results of this giant tower. Among them, some researchers expressed a view. That was, this giant tower was an extremely dangerous existence, and staying around it would cause them to endure some kind of danger that they were still unaware of. In other words, staying at the edge of this giant tower to build a civilization was not a wise choice. The best thing to do was to migrate the civilization and stay as far away from this giant tower as possible so that the dangers of this giant tower would be as far away from them as possible. However, this view was only spread among a small group of people. The living beings and cultivators who heard this view were dismissive of it, thinking that the researchers were exaggerating to scare them. As for migrating a civilization, it was even more impossible for them to do so. After all, it was migrating a civilization and not moving a house. Migrating a civilization involved many aspects. If a cultivator's mind was poured into it at the same time, it would definitely be enough to cause the smartest cultivator's head to explode and his entire body to be completely annihilated. How could such a complicated matter be carried out just because of a small group of people's opinions? In order to carry out such a migration, even if the largest and most authoritative organization in the entire civilization published a conclusion, it would definitely require thousands of years of research, experiments, and confirmations time and time again. Only then would there be a chance to carry it out. Therefore, it was not strange that these civilizations did not take any action in the end. On the contrary, if these civilizations took any action, it would be strange instead. Just as the cultivator landed, he suddenly sensed several auras coming over from afar. Those auras were thousands of miles away from him. Furthermore, every single aura was extremely weak, and it felt like they weren't much stronger than ordinary living beings. The cultivator's eyes flickered, and he immediately understood who they were and what their goal was. Looks like they're worried about their relatives and friends who entered the giant tower. The cultivator did not leave even though this thought flashed through his mind. He only carried out the various experiments that he had thought of before he left the giant tower. 4 cultivators before the appearance of public spaces. Leaving the giant tower was to relax and enjoy the achievements of cultivation. However, after the appearance of public spaces, such relaxation and enjoyment of cultivation could be completely done in public spaces. At this point, they no longer left the giant tower for these things. Instead, they usually left for a certain purpose. Perhaps it was to test out certain ideas that they could not test in the giant tower, or to resolve certain karma that they had in the outside world. Chapter 2390. The living beings that were ignored by the giant tower, and were not captured into the tower, were usually weaker living beings. Therefore, even though the cultivator had clearly sensed the living beings heading towards him, a few months had passed by the time the living beings finally arrived. It was so much so that during this period of time, there were countless cultivators coming out of the pagoda and heading towards various places in this world. As for the various methods that the cultivator wanted to experiment with, he had almost experimented with them. However, some of the methods were not mature enough, and he needed to adjust and modify them. That was why the cultivator was still here. He didn't return to the giant tower or leave this area to do some other cultivation. Fortunately, the living beings that went through a lot of hardships to rush over were able to see the cultivator. The cultivator was already an innate Grand Luo realm cultivator. Innate Grand Luo realm cultivators were merely ants to existences like Luo Fan and Duan Shi. However, to ordinary living beings, existences that could be self-sufficient, create their own energy, form their own bodies, and create their own worlds in time and space were definitely considered experts. Compared to the living beings that spent a few months rushing over from various places, the cultivator's strength was even more outstanding. Greetings, Overlord. The living beings did not know the cultivator, so they could only kneel obediently and greet the cultivator as the Overlord. The innate Grand Luo realm cultivator had a good impression of the living beings that spent a few months to come here. At the very least, they were willing to put in so much effort for their friends and family, and were willing to face an existence that could easily crush them and completely erase them for their sake. He had high hopes for their courage. Therefore, at this moment, his attitude towards these living beings was rather amiable. There's no need to be so courteous. I already know why you're here. However, I can't answer you. That's because there are just too many living beings in the giant tower, and I'm only an existence that's close to the bottom among them. I don't know what you want to know either, the cultivator said directly to the living beings. Hearing his words, the creatures all looked as if they had lost their parents. In the past few months, although they had seen many creatures leaving the giant tower, none of them had stayed in this area. Every single one of them flashed by, making it impossible for them to truly come into contact with them even if they discovered their existence. Only this high holiness in front of them could not only wait for them here, but also show them a good attitude and allow them to obtain some information inside the giant tower. However, it was a pity that even such an existence could not erase the doubts and worries in the depths of their hearts. It could not give them an effective answer at all. This could practically be considered as completely cutting off their last chance. How could they not be disappointed? As he gazed at the disappointed expressions of these living beings, the golden immortal realm cultivator suddenly smiled and said, "However, I have a way for all of you to figure it out yourselves. I wonder if all of you dare to accept it?" Upon hearing this, all the living beings were stunned. Many of the living beings reacted faster and instantly understood what the Khanate Grand Luo was talking about. For a moment, they hesitated and seemed to be struggling. However, most of the living beings did not know what the golden immortal realm cultivator was trying to say. They asked instinctively, "What way?" These living beings were clearly just ants before the golden immortal realm cultivator. However, the thoughts of such an existence were as clear as the lines on the palm of the golden immortal realm cultivator. He could see through them with just a glance. At that moment, he felt that it was very interesting. In fact, it was just as the golden immortal realm cultivator had said. His strength was considered to be at the bottom in the giant tower. At the very least, his strength was at the bottom in the circle that he was interested in. Such strength made him struggle between life and death in almost every mission. Every mission was equivalent to breaking through the boundaries of life and death with great difficulty, and it was difficult for him to find a chance of survival in the midst of death. Under such circumstances and for so many years, unimaginable pressure had piled up in his heart. In fact, even though he had left the giant tower to test out his various techniques, part of the reason was to relieve the pressure that had piled up in his heart for countless years. After all, even though he could carry out all sorts of activities to relieve pressure in the public space of the giant tower, it was within the tower in the end. To the living beings in the world, no matter how great the relief of pressure was, it couldn't compare to taking a walk in the outside world. At the very least, it was like that in the bottom of his heart. It was precisely because of this that the golden immortal realm cultivator had waited outside for such a long time. After all, there was a limit to kindness, and waiting for a few months for a little kindness wasn't the style of a golden immortal realm cultivator. In fact, this little bit of kindness was at most an excuse for the golden immortal realm cultivator. At this moment, when he saw these living beings struggling like this because of what he said, he felt the pressure in his heart reduce greatly instead. Even though he couldn't be said to have completely relaxed, it was still slightly less when compared to before. At that moment, he was sure that his choice was correct. To cultivators, everything else was secondary, and only one's own feelings and cultivation were the most important. For the sake of this, practically all cultivators were able to abandon everything and give up everything. Putting aside the fact that this connate perfected heavenly immortal realm cultivator was merely testing these living beings and torturing their spirits slightly, the connate perfected heavenly immortal realm cultivators were already capable of doing so. He immediately continued, "Wouldn't it be very clear if all of you just think about it? If you want to confirm their situation, then you naturally have to enter it yourself." All the living beings suddenly froze when they heard this. Entering the enormous pagoda to personally confirm exactly what happened to their friends and loved ones was something that they ought to be able to easily think of. However, up until now, not a single one of them dared to mention this. This was naturally because they were clearly aware that entering the enormous pagoda was simply akin to having a slim chance of survival. It was even to the extent that if it wasn't for the fact that the enormous pagoda looked down upon them, it would be utterly impossible for them to use this excuse to enter the enormous pagoda. It was even to the extent that they wouldn't dare stay in the surroundings of the enormous pagoda. When he saw the emotions in the hearts of these living beings surge while various complicated and chaotic thoughts surged ceaselessly into appearance, and all of them were either terrified, worried, pained, ashamed, or hateful, the golden immortal realm cultivator's mood became even more relaxed. We seem to be utterly unqualified to enter the enormous pagoda to carry out the assignment." One of the living beings mustered up the courage to speak like this. The golden immortal realm cultivator grinned and said, "There's no need to worry about that. I naturally have a way to help all of you enter the enormous pagoda. How about it? So long as all of you nod, then I'll be able to fulfill all of your expectations right away." The surroundings fell silent when they heard this. All the living beings started to struggle even harder. They ought to be able to think of something like this. After all, if they couldn't accomplish it, then wouldn't the golden immortal realm cultivator be making fun of them by suggesting this method? However, even though they were willing to run about for the sake of their friends and loved ones, it wasn't so easy for them to make up their minds to step into a place with a slim chance of survival for their friends and loved ones. Sacrificing oneself for others was something that everyone was capable of doing when they were daydreaming about it. But when the matter really came to a head and they really had to make a decision, then only very few were capable of doing it. Evidently, none of the living beings before him were prepared. As he watched the hearts of these living beings struggle even further and feel even more terror, the golden immortal realm cultivator suddenly smiled and said, "Fine, looks like all of you haven't made up your minds. Then forget it." As he spoke, he intended to fly up and leave this area. He was already satisfied after releasing so much of the pressure in his heart, and he felt that he had the motivation to head to the enormous tower and accept the life and death missions again and again. Right when he was about to vanish, a voice suddenly resounded. "Wait! I'm willing! Please grant my wish, exalted one!" It was the voice of a young man. The golden immortal realm cultivator looked over and saw that the person who spoke was a young man that seemed to be around 21 or 22 years old. He stood there while his entire body was drenched in cold sweat, but his expression was extremely firm. Based on his expression, it was obvious that the golden immortal realm cultivator had been struggling earlier. At this moment, the other living beings looked at the young man in disbelief. This young man had never been one of the bravest amongst this group of people. It was even to the extent that he seemed to be a coward all this while, and he even made way for the others to speak. However, at this moment, when everyone was unable to make up their minds, he actually dared to step forward. This caused all the living beings in the surroundings to suddenly feel that they didn't know this young man before them anymore. The golden immortal realm cultivator stopped in midair and looked down at the young man before he said, "Do you know what'll happen if you agree?" The young man nodded when he heard this, and he said, "I know. Please grant my wish, exalted one." At this moment, he seemed as if he'd let go of the extremely heavy burden in his heart, and his entire body emanated a feeling of relaxation and clarity. Moreover, his entire body emanated an indescribable sense of firmness. This sort of firmness caused him to seem to be fundamentally different when compared to the young man from before. His entire body was suffused with a form of charm that wasn't present in the past. This sort of charm caused him to seem like a crane amongst a flock of chickens amongst all the other living beings that were cowering in fear, and it caused the others to seem even more tiny and cowering in fear. The golden immortal realm cultivator instantly saw through the young man's mental journey, and he suddenly sighed with emotion. "I never expected that you would actually find yourself amidst this sort of pressure." Right as he spoke, a strand of aura suddenly shot out from the enormous pagoda, and it directly penetrated through space to arrive around the young man before it enveloped him within it. Subsequently, under the dumbstruck gazes of the other living beings, the strand of aura enveloped the young man as it slowly floated up into the air, and then it smashed towards the enormous pagoda. In the blink of an eye, he'd already smashed into the enormous pagoda and vanished without a trace. Obviously, he'd completely entered into the enormous pagoda, and he'd gone to carry out the various missions that the pagoda required them to carry out. The golden immortal realm cultivator revealed an indescribable expression when he saw this, and he said, "As expected, my guess was correct. This enormous pagoda doesn't require strength, but will." As he spoke, the glow of some sort of comprehension suddenly flashed on his body. Within this glow, he paid no further attention to the living beings in the surroundings, and his figure charged upwards. In the blink of an eye, he directly smashed into the enormous pagoda and vanished before the eyes of all the living beings in the surroundings. Meanwhile, the remaining living beings finally heaved sighs of relief, and then they fell weakly to the ground. Even though the golden immortal realm cultivator hadn't used any force to oppress them, and they didn't feel any impact on their bodies, the pressure brought to them by the interrogation of their souls was even greater than the pressure of their bodies and strength. At this moment, when the golden immortal realm cultivator vanished along with the interrogation, they finally clearly felt the exhaustion of their souls. At this moment, all of them seemed to be mentally and physically exhausted. However, even though there were an entire few hundreds of people here, not a single one of them spoke at this moment, and it was even to the extent that they tried their best to breathe softly. The surroundings seemed to be deathly silent. If it wasn't for the sound of breathing, no one would believe that there were a few hundred people here at all. On the other hand, all these living beings here were either looking down at the ground, the sky, or the space in the surroundings, yet not a single one of them dared to look the other living beings in the eyes. The entire scene seemed to be strange to the point it was unimaginable. Based on their expressions, one could tell exactly what these living beings were feeling at this moment. "Actually, I haven't made up my mind to look for them at all," The reason I'm wandering around this area is because my heart is empty, and I can't find my target. Such thoughts kept appearing in the hearts of all the living beings at this moment, causing them to be filled with disdain and contempt towards themselves. It was precisely because of such mental states that they didn't dare to look at each other at this moment. Because such a gaze would make them feel that their lowliest side was being seen by others. Exalted holiness? Exalted holiness! Wait for me. I want to go. Suddenly, one of the living beings roared and leaped up as if he'd just woken up from a dream, and he wanted to follow the golden immortal realm cultivator into the enormous pagoda. At this moment, the expressions of the others changed. Some were disdainful, and some were enlightened. Chapter 2391. More and more living beings joined in the pleading of the connate grand heavenly realm cultivator. It seemed like the crowd was surging with emotions, and all of their expressions were filled with urgency and desire. Only an extremely small number of living beings maintained their ashamed expressions. As the crowd surged with emotions, the shame in the hearts of the living beings was gradually drowned. Their expressions calmed down, and the shame and pain they originally felt gradually vanished. Each and every one of them felt at ease again. Unfortunately, it's too late for me to make up my mind. The exalted Lord has already left. One of the living beings sighed with an extremely regretful expression. This living being was the first living being to plead with the connate grand heavenly realm cultivator to bring him into the huge tower. At this moment, his face was filled with an awe-inspiring aura. He didn't seem as timid and ashamed as before, and it was practically impossible for others to connect him with his previous self. The others also expressed that they hesitated for too long, and the connate grand heavenly realm cultivator didn't have the patience to wait for them. In other words, it wasn't that they didn't have the courage, but the connate grand heavenly realm cultivator didn't give them time. Such behavior caused a hint of disgust to flash through the eyes of some of the living beings whose expressions hadn't changed much all this while. In the end, when those living beings even blamed the connate grand heavenly realm cultivator, and they felt that it was because the connate grand heavenly realm cultivator spoke too sternly earlier that they couldn't react in time, and that was why they didn't follow the connate grand heavenly realm cultivator into the huge tower immediately, one of the living beings finally couldn't help but speak with disdain in his heart. If all of you really made up your mind, the huge tower would have sucked all of you in by now. I don't believe any of you didn't notice that the exalted Lord didn't do anything at all earlier, and it was the huge tower itself that pulled all of you in, said the living being indifferently. As he spoke, he couldn't be bothered to pay any more attention to the other living beings, and he turned around and left. However, he was already ashamed to be associated with these living beings. When the other living beings heard this, their expressions froze, and they were stunned on the spot. How could any of them not notice it? It was just that none of them were willing to admit it. After all, it wasn't easy to admit one's cowardice and lack of courage. The reason why they had acted so imposing and awe-inspiring before was to give themselves an excuse, to cover up their previous cowardice. Now that this creature had directly opened up their scars, they could no longer deceive themselves. None of them could continue boasting like before. They looked at each other and found that their expressions were a bit stiff. All of them wanted to open their mouths, but they seemed to have nothing to say. They couldn't find any way to whitewash what that creature had said. Only the truth could not be whitewashed, of course. They could come up with thousands of excuses to whitewash the truth, but deep in their hearts, they clearly knew what the truth was. In the end, he was just deceiving himself. This kind of deception might have been meaningful in front of the unknown person, but at this moment, in front of so many companions, so many people who knew him through and through, what meaning did it have? It was just a competition of acting skills. Perhaps everyone was looking at each other with eyes full of contempt and disdain. At that moment, all the living beings felt that everything was so boring. They stood there at a loss as to what to do. Subsequently, the living beings started to leave the crowd and walk towards other directions. Not long after, there were only a few living beings left. As expected, lying to ourselves is useless. We really are selfish and cowardly, one of the living beings muttered with a bitter expression. Following that, the other living beings no longer had the face to stay here, and they left one by one. In the end, there was nothing left here, and only the traces left behind by the connate Grand Luo cultivator. As for those who had come with great desire, they were only left in a sorry state like stray dogs when they left in the end. When these living beings were looking for their friends and family, there was no lack of them boasting to others, and there was no lack of them expressing to others how much they cared about them and how much they longed to meet their friends and family. However, when they finally encountered an opportunity, only one of them mustered the courage to risk his life and enter the huge tower. This difference caused all the living beings to lose the courage to travel with others. In the following days, these living beings left the surroundings of the huge tower one by one. They'd recognized their own nature, and they didn't dare to stay around the huge tower any longer. They'd completely suppressed their worries for their friends and family, their own fears, and their own selfishness. From today onwards, they'd become completely different. All of them lived extremely lowly lives, and they'd never stepped into the surroundings of the huge tower in their entire life. Even if their friends and family came out of the tower in the future, they wouldn't be able to find any of them. The connate Grand Luo cultivator who stepped into the huge tower didn't pay any attention to these changes. At this moment, he'd returned to the public space within the huge tower. The public space was filled with living beings now. Compared to before he left, the number of living beings had increased by a great deal. Compared to before the huge tower changed, the number had increased by thousands of times. In the past, although there were countless cultivators in the public space, the number of cultivators was nothing compared to the entire public space. The entire public space still looked empty, and it was enough for cultivators to occupy large tracts of land in the public space and establish their own immortals' cave abodes and Taoist rite. There was even no lack of cultivators who occupied areas that spanned hundreds of millions of miles. However, at this moment almost every place in the public space was filled with buildings. Not to mention establishing abodes that spanned hundreds of millions of miles, even the slightly larger abodes had been dismantled. There were even tall buildings appearing everywhere in the public space, and the situation of people crowding together was even more real. In fact, if the public space hadn't become like this, there wouldn't have been so many cultivators leaving the huge tower to relax, test their abilities, or end their karma. Even though many of them could only test their abilities in the outside world, and practically all of them had to end their karma in the outside world, it didn't mean that they were willing to leave this place if it wasn't attractive enough. After all, it wasn't actually necessary to test their abilities and conjectures. So long as they were able to deduce more strictly and consider more deeply, such experiments could be replaced by other methods. If the public space was attractive enough, then they would be willing to spend more time here. As for ending their karma, there was no need to mention it. If the public space was attractive enough, then those cultivators would actually be willing to let go of their karma. However, it was obvious that the crowded public space had lost its attraction to the numerous cultivators in the huge tower. Presently, there were even many cultivators who would rather complete their missions than stay in the public space. Thus, it was obvious why so many of them had left the huge tower successively. The connate Grand Luo cultivator looked at the public space, while a trace of helplessness flashed through his heart. There are actually still so many people. Those missions are so dangerous, so why are there still so many of them alive? This thought flashed through his mind. He'd already been in the outside world for a few months. According to the calculation of time, a few thousand years had passed in the public space. However, after such a long period of time had passed, the number of people in the public space actually hadn't decreased at all. Conversely, it had actually increased greatly instead, and this caused him to be greatly disappointed. Perhaps I can think of a way to reorganize this public space. Even though the population wouldn't decrease and the area wouldn't increase, if there's order, then perhaps the space we can move about in would increase. At this instant, the Khanate Grand Luo cultivator shot his gaze towards the numerous tall buildings that had appeared out of thin air. Originally, as an ordinary Khanate Grand Luo cultivator, he would just accept the situation in the public space, and even if he couldn't bear the sight of it, he would just leave and not stay here. However, at this moment, he suddenly felt a strong sense of mission. He felt that the public space before him was his responsibility, and he should work hard to change the situation in the public space so that it could return to its original state of comfort and leisure. It shouldn't become like this, a place that caused others to feel pain just by staying here for a moment longer. All those years ago, that expert created this public space for the sake of benefiting all living beings. The current state of this public space has already violated his objective. If I allow this public space to continue like this, then I'll be letting that expert down. This thought suddenly appeared in the heart of the Khanate Grand Luo cultivator, and it caused his entire aura to change along with it. At this moment, because of this change in his will, he seemed to have changed quite a bit compared to before. All these thoughts that shouldn't have appeared in his heart had suddenly appeared out of thin air, and the entire process was so natural that even the Khanate Grand Luo cultivator couldn't sense anything wrong with it. After he'd made up his mind, he started to work hard for this objective without any regard for the consequences. With my strength alone, it's impossible to make everyone listen to my arrangements and establish order in the entire public space. The only way to achieve this objective is to complete the assignments and rely on the rewards of the assignments. Even though the thoughts of the Khanate Grand Luo cultivator had been changed by some unknown and mysterious existence, he was still a Khanate Grand Luo cultivator in the end, and he was still someone with a firm will and clear mind. At this moment, he'd instantly determined how he should accomplish this great ambition that had suddenly appeared. As soon as this thought was confirmed, he even gave up on the idea of resting in the public space, and he directly turned around and headed towards the entrance of the assignment world that he was most skilled in at the edge of the public space. After a long period of development, the cultivators within the gigantic tower had already determined the limits of their abilities. They knew what tasks they were good at and what tasks they were not good at. Under such circumstances, they would naturally choose assignments that they were skilled in and avoid assignments that they weren't skilled in. The existence of the public space allowed them to have the authority to make such choices. After all, the various interfaces of the assignment worlds in the public space represented the paths to different assignment worlds, and different assignment worlds naturally represented different assignments. Even if each mission world was only determined when a living being entered, after so many years of summarizing directions, almost every living being knew which direction, which position, and which time to enter would lead to the kind of mission world that would be created. Of course, it wasn't 100% accurate, and it was only 80% to 90% accurate at most. However, compared to being able to wait at random and try their luck, such accuracy was sufficient for all living beings to go after it. Right when the Khanate Grand Luo cultivator entered the interface of the assignment world, a figure appeared where the Khanate Grand Luo cultivator was. This figure was none other than the only cultivator who had mustered up the courage to be sucked in by the giant tower. However, compared to his previous state of being a mere mortal, this living being was now a quasi-saint realm expert. His strength had surpassed the Khanate Grand Luo cultivator a long time ago. Moreover, his strength had surpassed the Khanate Grand Luo cultivator by countless times. At this moment, the quasi-saint had a strange expression on his face as he watched the Khanate Grand Heavenly Immortal Realm cultivator vanish from his sight. He seemed to be sorrowful, grateful, and even hateful. I didn't expect to be so lucky to meet him. You tortured my soul that day, so I'll teach you a lesson now. From today onward, we're even. The cultivator gazed at the spot where the connate golden immortal realm cultivator vanished, while such a thought flashed in his heart. He was the one who changed the connate grand luo cultivator's mentality. Is it interesting to toy with a connate grand luo cultivator like this? At this moment, another figure appeared by his side and spoke in a helpless tone. Toy? I don't think that's toying with him. I'm giving him a chance to become a hero. The quasi-saint sneered when he heard this. Chapter 2392. Why can't I succeed? If I can become a demi-saint in a few short missions, why can't he complete this seemingly impossible mission after a few more missions? The demi-saint calmly replied. The cultivator who came later sneered, so be it. Is it interesting to use your own fortuitous encounter as an excuse? The demi-saint only replied, very interesting. Hearing his words, the cultivators who came later were left speechless. Forget it, I can't be bothered with you. As long as you think it's interesting. What do you plan to do next? There seems to be a tail left behind from the previous mission. Do you want to take care of it? The cultivator asked after a while. The demi-saint shook his head and said, no, let's wait for a while more. I want to see how he dies. Say, is there a need for that? All he did was torture your mind a little. You've also gained enough benefits to become a demi-saint from an ordinary person. Moreover, it was in just a few short missions. Do you really have to watch him die? The cultivator couldn't help but ask in the end. It's not a matter of whether I need it or not, but whether I can do it. I was weak before him before, so he could deceive and torture me at will. Now that I'm strong, I can deceive and torture him at will. If he can do that, why can't I? The demi-saint said. The cultivator shook his head and said, forget it. Since you're not interested in carrying out the mission right away, take a rest. As he spoke, his figure slowly dissipated and disappeared without a trace in a short while. The demi-saint's expression didn't change at all even after the cultivator disappeared. He only stared at the spot where the connate grand luo cultivator disappeared. The flow of time in every mission was different. The flow of time in the public space was different as well, and each had its own characteristic. Some missions might take billions of years to be equivalent to a moment in the public space. On the other hand, some missions might take hundreds of thousands of years to be equivalent to a moment in the public space. As for how fast the time flow of the mission would flow, it would depend on the luck of the person executing the mission. Even the cultivator who had the deepest understanding of missions and the public space couldn't have a clear grasp of this. As for the quasi-sage, there was no need to mention it. He'd stepped into the tower from the outside world before the connate grand immortal realm cultivator. During this process, he'd encountered a few assignment worlds where the flow of time was unimaginably fast, and he'd relied on his luck and wisdom to obtain unimaginable benefits from the assignment worlds, allowing him to grow from an ordinary person into a quasi-saint realm expert. However, the amount of time he had spent in the tower was still too short. Although his understanding of the public space was not limited to the surface, it was definitely not deep enough. Therefore, he did not do much research on the difference in the flow of time between the public space and the mission time. At this moment, he was completely unable to grasp the time it would take for the connate golden immortal realm cultivator to complete the mission, leave the mission world, and return to the public space. So all he could do at this moment was to wait ceaselessly here, and he was waiting for the golden immortal realm cultivator that would return at any moment. Perhaps it would happen in the next moment, or perhaps it would never happen in the process of waiting. His body was like a statue floating in the void, motionless. In the distance, the bustling public space was constantly showing off how crowded it was, and there was practically no empty space for people to come and go as they pleased. Could be said that if it wasn't for the fact that this place was close to the exit of the mission world, one might be sucked away by the mission world if they approached this place. This place would be filled with living beings and cultivators, and there would not be such an empty space for the quasi-sage to stare blankly. He'd been waiting for 100 years. On a certain day after 100 years, the quasi-sage suddenly snapped out of his daze and turned to look at the person beside him. At this moment, the cultivator who'd left all those years ago had reappeared. Compared to before, this cultivator did not change much. Clearly, he hadn't carried out any missions throughout these years as well. What do you think? You still don't want to carry out the mission? It's already been 100 years, there's no point in waiting any longer, right? The cultivator looked at the quasi-sage and sighed. The quasi-sage glanced at him, and then looked at the spot where the connate golden immortal realm cultivator had entered 100 years ago. Finally, a look of hesitation appeared on his face. Obviously, since the innate golden immortal realm cultivator hadn't returned after over 100 years, he'd started to suspect that the innate golden immortal realm cultivator might have perished in the mission world. Looks like I've overestimated him. I didn't think that I wouldn't even be able to complete the mission. He sighed after a long while. The cultivator who came later was overjoyed when he heard this. You've finally given up? That's great, then let's hurry up and carry out that mission. I wonder if there'll be any changes to that mission after waiting for 100 years. The quasi-sage merely sighed and said, Let's go. I just hope that the mission you mentioned was worth waiting for all these years. As he spoke, he looked at the cultivator who came later meaningfully. Of course it's worth it. This is a continuous wish mission. If you can complete it, you might even be able to change the order of the entire public space as you originally wanted. The cultivator who came later said directly. He knew very well what the quasi-sage was thinking. In fact, the quasi-sage was the one who really couldn't stand the order of the public space. After all, if it wasn't for the fact that he couldn't stand the order of the public space and wanted to give it a true and orderly order, why would he give it to the connate golden immortal realm cultivator as a grand wish? However, as a quasi-sage, he knew very well how chaotic the public space was, and he knew how difficult it was to change the order of the public space. That was why he gave it to the connate golden immortal realm cultivator as a form of revenge instead of working hard to implement it himself. When the quasi-sage heard the cultivator's words, he said indifferently, The greater the hope, the greater the disappointment. Trying to change the order of this place by making a wish? Don't even think about it. You'll only know if you try. Didn't you rely on this mentality to progress so quickly back then? The cultivator who came later didn't seem to mind and smiled. The quasi-sage merely shook his head and paid no more attention to the cultivator. Just as the two of them were talking and leaving, a buzzing sound suddenly rang out from the spot where the sage-to-be had been staring at for 100 years. The sound was so strange that it caused everyone in the public space to involuntarily turn their gazes towards the source of the sound. What's going on? Who's trying to change the public space? The cultivators were bewildered. Not everyone was dissatisfied with the order of the public space, but not everyone was satisfied either. In fact, apart from the quasi-sage, there were many people who wanted to change the order of the public space. They wanted to make the public space into an orderly and perfect public space with sufficient space for activities. However, there were also many cultivators who wanted to maintain the state of affairs and the benefits that it brought to them. Once they tried to implement the new order, they would suffer a huge backlash from the cultivators, which would lead to some sort of shocking war. That was why they didn't have the courage to implement the new order. At this moment, the cultivators discovered the changes in the public space coming from the port of the mission world, which stirred up their emotions one after another. Who's overestimating themselves this time? Another cultivator who opposed suddenly flew into a rage at this moment. One beam of light after another charged forward from various directions. In just the blink of an eye, the place was surrounded by a high number of cultivators. A false sage noticed the quasi-sage and the cultivator who came later and asked coldly, You guys were here first. Do you know what happened here? As a false sage, he occupied a large territory in the public space. All living beings who wanted to settle down in his territory had to obtain his permission. Because of this, he was equivalent to a landlord in this public space. Maintaining the order in front of him was where his interests lay. Under such circumstances, he naturally detested all cultivators who wanted to change the order of this place. Being stared at by this false sage, the two cultivators felt their bodies tremble. It was as if the infinite world and the infinite universe were constantly crushing them from all directions. It felt as if they were going to die in the next moment, and their souls were going to dissipate, even though they knew that this false sage couldn't really kill them in this public space. The two cultivators still felt boundless fear emerge from the bottom of their hearts. At this moment, the buzzing sound coming from the port of the mission world became more and more intense. Vaguely, there was a strong light coming from it, constantly spreading in all directions. Facing this light, the false sage couldn't care less about the two cultivators' answers. At this moment, his body released countless rays of light and began to quickly block the light coming from the port. He wanted to block the light around the port and prevent it from changing the public space. At this moment, the light that was released from the port trembled slightly and suddenly turned into boundless lightning, brazenly shattering all the light and power in front of it. The entire process was so straightforward that it was beyond imagination. It was as if what was blocking the lightning was just some fragile tofu, and one couldn't even see any resistance, facing the light and power that he released being shattered by the lightning. Even the false sage couldn't help but let out a muffled groan, and blood flowed from the corner of his mouth. It was the backlash from the destruction of its own power and brilliance. This kind of backlash shouldn't have hurt him too much, and he only needed to take a breath to easily eliminate this backlash. However, it was a pity that the matter could not be salvaged in a single breath's time. The light instantly penetrated his location and swept across the entire public space. In the blink of an eye, it had completely covered the entire public space. In this public space, the false sage wasn't the only cultivator who opposed the change in order. However, apart from the false sage, there were still many other cultivators who opposed the change in order. However, compared to the false sage, even the strongest of the other cultivators could only be comparable to the false sage. Therefore, they were all full of confidence in the actions of the false sage, who was the closest to the source of the change. Therefore, when the false sage failed, none of them could react in time. None of them could stop the light in time. In the end, by the time they reacted, the light had already enveloped the entire public space. It had completely enveloped their location and their territory, suppressing all external forces that they could use. At this point, unless they could completely destroy the entire public space, they wouldn't be able to stop the light no matter what. At this moment, the light began to brighten continuously. From its originally faint and even negligible state, it began to grow continuously. In just a few breaths, the light had already become more dazzling and bright than the sun. Moreover, this light had the effect of ignoring cultivation and cultivation. No matter how powerful or profound a cultivator was, they couldn't resist this light at all. They could only feel their vision becoming blank and everything around them being covered by the light. Only their ears could hear all sorts of strange sounds around them, as well as strange movements that kept appearing. Even the various rules and laws of the entire public space began to gradually change at this time, gradually turning into a state that was completely unfamiliar to all cultivators. The process of this change completely surpassed time. No matter how fast those cultivators reacted, they couldn't determine the specific process of the change. They only knew that their vision was completely covered by the light, and then countless strange movements appeared around them. Immediately after, the rules and laws of the entire public space changed. In the end, when everything calmed down, the surrounding public space had already become extremely unfamiliar to them. It was like a brand new public space that was completely different from before. Chapter 2393. At this moment, the public space had completely changed its appearance. The originally scattered buildings in the entire space had completely disappeared. Instead, they were replaced by towering skyscrapers that stood in every corner of this public space in an extremely mysterious manner. Looking at the size of the skyscrapers, they were not inferior to the sculpture in the center at all. Apart from these skyscrapers, there were squares of different shapes and functions, as well as roads that floated in midair. There were only a few figures left of the originally densely packed living beings in the public space. Among them, there was the quasi-saint and some cultivators near the mission world's port. At this moment, the power around them surged, and the brilliance in their bodies burst forth, but they were all resisting some kind of invisible power. In the end, apart from the fake saint, even the quasi-saint could not resist the laws that wanted to teleport them. Under the effect of this law, their figures gradually disappeared. Only the fake saint finally released a terrifying power with a furious roar, completely eliminating the effects of that power on him. "How dare you do this?" As he eliminated the effects of the strange laws on him, he suddenly let out a furious roar. The aura on his body surged violently, and it began to sweep in all directions. The entire public space began to shake violently at this moment, as if there was an invisible hand grabbing the public space and shaking it continuously. The number of living beings in the entire public space was calculated in the hundreds of millions. Without so many living beings, it would be impossible to fill the almost infinitely vast public space, causing all living beings to not have enough space to move around. At this moment, the number of skyscrapers that appeared out of thin air was calculated in the hundreds of millions. Although the number of skyscrapers was much less than the number of living beings themselves. However, in terms of absolute quantity, it was already extremely impressive. Each of these skyscrapers had tens of thousands of stories. There were hundreds of rooms on each floor. In other words, each skyscraper had millions or even tens of millions of rooms. These rooms were not the kind of rooms that ordinary mortals lived in. Instead, they were small spaces. It was a small space that could be manipulated, changed, transformed, and expanded at will by the occupants. In other words, every skyscraper was a combination of millions or even tens of millions of small spaces. If any one of these towering skyscrapers were to be placed in the secular world, it would be enough to become a holy land of the heavens and earth, a goal that all living beings yearned for. However, at this time, in this public space, such a skyscraper was calculated in the hundreds of millions. They were scattered all over the world. If it weren't for the fact that they formed an indescribable formation in an extremely mysterious manner, perhaps just these buildings alone would be enough to make the world seem congested. Of course, the battle array formed by these buildings did not just make these buildings appear less congested. Their real purpose was to perfectly integrate the building with the public space. This fusion allowed the countless buildings to be strongly protected by this public space. Anyone who wanted to shake these buildings or destroy them would have to obtain the consent of this public space first. In other words, one had to first destroy the laws of this public space in order to accomplish this. Even Duanji, who was already a supreme emperor, would find it difficult to completely destroy this public space, let alone a false saint cultivator. At this moment, he released his power in an attempt to shake this public space and reverse all the changes that the light had made to this space. However, in the end, he realized that all his power could not shake anything in this space. On the contrary, during this process, an increasingly powerful force was constantly crushing him from all directions. The more power he released, the stronger it was, and the more crushing it would be. Very soon, the crushing power surpassed the false saint's endurance. As the entire public space shook violently, it broke through the false saint's defense and slammed into the false saint's body. It completely crushed the false saint's body, turning it into powder in an instant. Fortunately, no matter how weak this false saint was, he was still a false saint. As a false saint, His body did not necessarily need to be fixed. At this moment, even if he was crushed and turned into powder, his life would still not be affected. Moreover, because his body was crushed, the power that he had been continuously releasing to shake the entire public space and change everything in this public space had also completely disappeared. With the disappearance of this power, the public space no longer had any power that could be transmitted to him. The restraint of this power allowed the false saint to finally avoid the danger of being crushed by the public space. The entire public space also stopped shaking and returned to its initial calm state. After a while, the false saint's figure condensed again and appeared directly at his original position. Compared to before, he was already in a much more sorry state, and there was unconcealable fear in his eyes. It was a fear of this public space and the existence that caused all of this. It's not bad that this space has become like this. At this moment, a voice entered the false saint's ears. When the false saint heard this, his body trembled and he looked towards the source of the voice. He realized that there was a figure only a few dozen feet away from him. Looking at the appearance of this figure, it was obvious that he had been floating there for an unknown period of time. Looking at this figure, the false saint could not help but mutter, "Alliance Master." The expression on his face became incomparably ashamed. The figure that appeared there was naturally Duan Shur. Since this false saint could call Duan Shur the Alliance Master, he was obviously a member of the Supreme Alliance back then. Duan Shur looked at the false saint whose rationality was covered by his selfishness and sighed. It's beneficial for everyone that this space has become like this. You'd better put away your selfishness. Hearing his words, the false saint did not dare to argue and could only agree obediently. He no longer resisted the pulling force of this public space on him. He followed the pulling force and teleported, disappearing from this location and entering the room that the public space had prepared for him. Seeing this, Duan Shur's expression did not change. He turned his head to look at the port of the mission world that had caused the huge change in the entire public space. His cultivation realm was that of a supreme emperor, and his strength had long surpassed all living beings in this world apart from Luo Fan. Such a realm was enough for him to see countless things that other living beings could not. To him, the port of the mission world was also within the range of what he could see. At this moment, his gaze pierced through the port and saw the mission world behind it. He saw the existence of a quasi-saint who was walking towards the public space with great difficulty. Not only did I fulfill my grand wish in this mission, but I also made a breakthrough in my cultivation realm. This luck. Looking at this figure, Duan Shur could not help but feel emotional. Although no one saw him, in reality, he had been standing there since the beginning. He saw how the innate Grand Luo was tricked into entering the mission world, how the quasi-saint waited here for the result, how the mission world released its power in the end, how the public space was changed, and how the false saint was enraged. He saw everything clearly with his 3 eyes. It was exactly because he saw all of this clearly that he understood exactly what sort of miracle had happened to the first Heaven Realm Golden Immortal Realm cultivator, who was now a quasi-saint. It's like there's an invisible hand controlling everything from behind. This thought instantly appeared in Duan Shur's mind, and a figure suddenly flashed across his mind. It was the figure of his teacher, Luo Fan. If there was an existence that could do all this and control all sorts of extremely subtle changes behind the scenes, no matter how he thought about it, it could only be his teacher who created this giant tower. However, it was obvious that he did not have any evidence to support this speculation. In fact, he was not even sure if there was really something controlling and affecting everything under his gaze. The mission world's port slowly distorted. Soon after, a figure began to slowly appear. "I'm finally back. I wonder if this public space has changed," the figure said as he looked into the distance. After the figure appeared, he looked into the distance and continuously released his perception in all directions. He began to do his best to envelop the entire world in his perception. Soon, he finally understood the situation in this world. He could not help but reveal an extremely excited expression on his face. His body even began to tremble slightly. "I've succeeded. I've finally succeeded. I've changed the entire public space, and made this place an orderly place no matter how many living beings enter," he roared with an extremely excited expression on his face. The aura on his body began to expand crazily, and his aura rose rapidly. At this moment, the entire public space began to tremble slightly. However, this tremble was completely different from the tremble caused by the false saint previously. Back then, the tremble was a form of resistance. One could even say that it was fear. But now, the trembling was from joy, and excitement. Along with this change, wisps of magical power were continuously produced from all over the public space. They gradually gathered towards the body of the quasi-saint and entered his body, causing his body to undergo an indescribable sublimation. His cultivation realm also began to rise bit by bit. When he first stepped into the public space, his cultivation realm was only at the beginner quasi-saint stage. However, in just a short while, he actually broke through realms and became a peak quasi-saint. He was only a step away from becoming a false saint. This speed of improvement made Duanshi's eyebrows twitch. Although it was not difficult for him to break through in this realm back then, and it was much faster than ordinary cultivators, it still required a process. However, it was also a process. He himself had put in a lot of effort and even suffered enough pain. Who would have thought that the cultivator in front of him would be able to break through so easily? He did not even feel any pressure at all. He did not even feel much, and he had already achieved such a breakthrough. This contrast made even Duanshi, who was as open-minded as he was, feel an inexplicable sense of jealousy. When the improvement given by the public space stopped, the cultivator was already at the boundary between a quasi-saint and a false saint. He seemed to be considered a false saint, but he also seemed to be a quasi-saint. Judging from this, he could already be considered a half-false saint. At this moment, the cultivator slowly opened his eyes, and the confusion in his eyes began to gradually dissipate. "I can't believe there's such an unexpected gain. It's a pity that I didn't obtain it through my own cultivation, so it can only be regarded as an external object." Sensing the changes in his body, the cultivator had an inexplicable expression on his face. It seemed to be a pity and a little regretful. Suddenly, he sensed something, and his 3 eyes focused in Duanshi's direction. His gaze seemed to penetrate endless space-time and directly see Duanshi's body. "Who's here?" he snorted and said. Duanshi frowned. He did not expect the other party to be able to see his existence. One must know that although he was only in an ordinary state of concealment, even a false saint would not be able to see his existence if he did not want to be seen. However, the cultivator in front of him was only a half-step pseudo-sage. Compared to a pseudo-sage, there were at least 9 realms between him and the pseudo-sage. Under such circumstances, he could actually see him in such a strange way and discover his existence. How could he not be surprised? "You can actually see me?" Since he had been seen, Duanshi naturally did not bother to continue hiding. His figure appeared out of thin air and said to the half-false saint in a curious tone. Seeing such a figure suddenly appear in the empty space, the half-false saint's expression suddenly changed, and he said, "There's really someone here. Who are you? What's the point of hiding?" Duanshi looked at the cultivator, and could not help but show an inexplicable smile. He said, "So it's just a guess. It seems that this public space has given you the authority. I thought there was something wrong with my method." Seeing Duanshi's expression, the half-false saint's expression began to change. Chapter 2394. At this moment, the pseudo-saint cultivator's expression became even more vigilant. He had even unknowingly begun to mobilize the power of the entire public space. Duan Shi began to form an inexplicable pressure. It seemed like he wanted to use the power of the public space to subdue Duan Shi. Facing such pressure, Duan Shi only smiled faintly and said, "If your realm isn't high enough, no matter how strong your power is, it's just a burden." As he spoke, he did not make any movements, but his existence had already disappeared from the pseudo-saint cultivator's perception. This change made the pseudo-saint cultivator's expression change even more. One must know that Duan Shi was still there in his eyes at this moment. It did not look any different from before. However, in his perception, that place had become empty. Even time and space did not seem to exist. How could he accept such a strange difference? At this moment, he also clearly felt what Duan Shi was talking about, the burden of power. Due to losing its target, the infinite power in the public space collided with each other at this moment. The forces began to transmit to each other, and in the end, the entire public space began to shake violently. As it shook, the pseudo-saint cultivator felt the power in his body shake violently. The qi and blood in his body flowed in reverse, and an indescribable pain began to appear in his body. His body trembled and instantly exploded, turning into powder that kept rolling in the void. After a while, the powder reformed into the pseudo-saint cultivator's body, allowing him to recover. At this moment, the turbulence in the public space gradually subsided. Everything seemed like nothing had happened. Seeing this, Duan Shi smiled faintly and said, "Don't be afraid. I don't intend to do anything to you." If he said this before, the pseudo-saint cultivator would not believe him at all. However, after what happened just now, he no longer had any doubts after hearing these words. There was only an inexplicable sense of peace emerging from the bottom of his heart. "Thank you, Senior. May I know why you're here to see me?" the pseudo-saint cultivator immediately said. Duan Shi shook his head and said, "I don't have any intentions. I just want to see what kind of existence caused this change in the public space." Hearing this, the half-pseudo-sacred cultivator was taken aback. He did not expect Duan Shi to appear before him just for this purpose. In his mind, there should be something for him to do, or something to teach him a lesson. However, as a weakling, he could only accept whatever the strong said. Thus, he said, "There's nothing special about me. I'm sorry to disappoint you." "I'm not disappointed. You have an unimaginable luck on you." Duan Shi smiled. His gaze seemed to be fixed on the half-sage pseudo-sage, but it seemed to have directly penetrated all the appearances of the half-sage pseudo-sage and reached the deeper essence of the half-sage pseudo-sage. Being stared at by this gaze, the half-step fake sage felt as though all of his secrets could no longer be concealed. This kind of feeling was naturally extremely uncomfortable, but obviously, under the situation where his strength was far inferior to others, he could only endure this kind of discomfort. "What luck?" he simply asked. "If you can't feel it, it's useless no matter how much I explain. Once you can feel it, you'll be able to understand it without any explanation from me," Duan Shi said. As he spoke, his figure flickered and disappeared in front of the half-sage pseudo-sacred cultivator. Seeing the powerhouse suddenly disappear, the half-sage pseudo-sacred cultivator had a strange expression on his face. He seemed to be surprised, in disbelief, and at a loss. "He left just like that? Did he really just come to see me out of curiosity? Is he really that bored and willful?" All sorts of thoughts flashed through the half-sage pseudo-sacred cultivator's mind. With this thought in mind, his perception fused with the public space, and he began to thoroughly investigate every inch of space-time in the entire public space. He thoroughly investigated every rule and law in it, searching for the countless trillions of small spaces that he had made a wish to create. However, in the end, he did not find what he was looking for. It was as though that powerhouse had never entered the public space. He did not leave any traces behind. "I'm still too weak after all," At this moment, the half-sage pseudo-sacred cultivator could only sigh inexplicably. He was naturally quite certain about the existence of Duan-Shi. Duan-Shi had appeared right in front of him, displaying his existence right in front of him. He did not believe that the Duan-Shi that he had seen before was just an illusion. Since it was not an illusion and he could not find any traces of Duan-Shi no matter how he searched, there was obviously only one possibility. That was, his strength was truly too weak to the point that he couldn't detect the slightest trace left behind by his opponent. With this thought in mind, the half-sage pseudo-sacred cultivator no longer stayed in the public space, nor did he pay attention to the quasi-sage who had schemed against him. He directly turned around and rushed into the port of the mission world that he had just come out from, re-entering a new mission world. That's right. When he became the holder of special authority in this public space, the half-sage pseudo-sacred cultivator already knew that he had been schemed against. After becoming the holder of special authority, he already had unimaginable authority in this public space. This authority was enough for him to thoroughly investigate the past and future of this public space. Although he could not be omniscient and know everything, however, he had already completely grasped everything that was related to him. Everything that happened after he left this public space, including the conversation between the quasi-sage and the other cultivators after he left, he had clearly seen it all. After seeing all this clearly, if he still did not understand what was going on, he would not have been able to cultivate to this stage. Before the appearance of Duan-Ji, he actually had the intention to settle the score with that quasi-saint. After all, although he had obtained enough benefits in the end, that quasi-sage had schemed against him. His intention was definitely vicious. The benefits that he could obtain were his own ability and luck. The other party's malicious intention was his own malice. However, he was not open-minded enough to ignore the other party's malicious intention just because he had obtained benefits. If Duan-Shi did not appear, that quasi-sage would definitely have been tortured by him. Perhaps he would have been forced into some mission worlds that the quasi-sage was not good at and suffered the torture of the mission worlds. However, it was obvious that such an if didn't happen. Duan-Shi appeared, however. The appearance of Duan-Shi clearly displayed a kind of absolute power in front of the quasi-sage. It made the quasi-sage finally understand how far he was from being truly powerful. He truly knew how much progress he needed to make before he could obtain true freedom. After understanding this, the thought of revenge from before became incomparably insignificant. He could no longer bear to waste his time for the satisfaction of his revenge. Because of this, he directly turned around and left this public space at this moment. He wanted to go back to the mission world to accept the challenge of the mission world and work hard to plunder the benefits that could make him stronger from the mission world. Although it was the same port and he had just come out of that port for a short time. However, after entering it again, the mission world that the port pointed to was no longer the same as before. This new mission world produced an indescribable attraction that directly sucked the quasi-sage, causing him to lose his ability to control himself and start to rush towards the mission world involuntarily. This charge caused the various powers, and authorities that he had grasped to scatter and scatter. In the end, when he really rushed into the mission world, he had already become an extremely weak cultivator, an ordinary cultivator that was only a few times stronger than ordinary people. The feeling of being directly knocked down from the high and mighty quasi-sage was really unbearable. The quasi-sage stood quietly for a long time before he stopped the urge to roar. After a long time, he let out a long breath and thought to himself, "I didn't expect to receive such treatment." There were many sayings in the public space. One of them said that when a true powerhouse entered the mission world, their power would be deprived and they would become countless times weaker than themselves. They would then have to carry out a mission that was difficult to complete even if they were not weakened. This saying was very popular, and it was said that it had also been confirmed by many powerhouses. However, the quasi-sage had never encountered such a thing before, and he had always been skeptical about it. It wasn't until now, when this happened to him, that he realized that this saying was actually true. After comforting himself with the saying that he had unknowingly become a true powerhouse, the quasi-sage began to pay attention to his surroundings. Looking around, he could not help but curse in his heart. This mission world was actually a world of the apocalypse. There were no traces of civilization in the entire world. At a glance, the entire world was filled with destruction, barbarism, and despair. Even though he had become an extremely weak cultivator, he was still a quasi-sage powerhouse after all. His eyesight was still far from what ordinary cultivators could compare to. At this moment, he could see plumes of smoke rising into the sky in the distance, as well as waves of murderous chi. As he listened attentively, he could faintly hear countless battle cries and cries continuously pouring into his ears. Clean up the world. Exterminate all the wild beasts in the world. Immediately afterward, the quasi-sage began to confirm his mission. Through the faint feeling, he confirmed his goal in this mission world. This goal made him curse in his heart again. After all, he was only a weak cultivator who was several times stronger than ordinary people. However, the so-called wild beasts in this world were much more powerful than him before they were weakened. Furthermore, the seemingly ordinary dire beast that was staring at him not far away already possessed the ability to freeze him on the spot with just its aura, rendering him unable to move. Under such circumstances, it would be so difficult for him to clean up all the wild beasts in this world. It would be too optimistic to say that it was a hellish level of difficulty. Could it be that every mission that a true powerhouse encounters is like this? If that's the case, how can they survive? This thought flashed through the quasi-sage powerhouse's mind. While this thought flashed through his mind, the wild beast not far away had already pounced toward him. This wild beast did not look special. It looked like a cow covered in scales, and its eyes had become red and violent. At this moment, the quasi-sage powerhouse felt his body begin to tremble slightly. A sense of danger emerged from the bottom of his heart, causing all the distracting thoughts in his mind to disappear in an instant. They were replaced by an indescribable desire to survive. At this moment, he flipped his body, and his strength, which was only several times stronger than that of ordinary people, was completely gathered together and sent to his feet. Then, he suddenly leaped up into the sky, which was dozens of meters high. The moment he leaped up, the wild beast flashed under him and directly rushed past his original position. Rumbling sounds kept coming from under his feet, and the terrifying sound made his heart beat a lot faster. At this moment, the wild beast did not stop. Instead, it instantly turned around and suddenly flicked the horns on its head, who was in the air. Although the horns were not short, they obviously could not hit the quasi-sage powerhouse, who was already dozens of meters high in the sky. However, at this moment, an indescribable sense of danger emerged in the quasi-sage powerhouse's heart again. Under this sense of danger, he did not dare to stay any longer. He gathered all the strength in his body and stepped on the void. His figure flickered in the air with incomparable agility, and he quickly dodged away from his original position. As he left his original spot, countless sharp blades slashed past his original position, emitting a chi-chi-chi-chi sound. It even created circles of ripples that spread in all directions. The quasi-sage powerhouse looked over and saw rays of light suddenly flashing on the horns of the wild beast, and the sharp blades were released from the horns. At this moment, the wild beast still did not stop. Its head turned, its body swayed, and the light on its horns flickered continuously. As it moved, waves of sharp blades constantly pounced at the quasi-sage powerhouse from below. It was like a cloud of sharp blades, constantly sweeping towards him. Chapter 2395. A million years later in the mission world, a world in the apocalypse seemed to be extremely close to destruction. It seemed like it would be destroyed in a few years or a few days. However, in reality, the endurance of a world was much stronger than anyone could imagine. Even after 1,000,000 years, this half-pseudo-sage mission world still maintained its original state in the apocalypse. It was still so desperate, desolate, and dangerous. After 1,000,000 years, although the half-pseudo-sage's cultivation base was still the same as it was at the beginning, which was only a few times stronger than ordinary people, his status was no longer as ordinary as before. After 1,000,000 years of struggle, he had now become the person with the highest status in this world. The organization he had established had already spread throughout the entire world. Almost every human settlement had a tentacle of his organization there. It's been 1,000,000 years. On this day, in the center of the largest human settlement, the half-pseudo-sage recalled his experience in the past 1,000,000 years, and he couldn't help but sigh. Thinking back on his experience in the past 1,000,000 years, he felt that he was struggling between life and death every day. Every time he saw the sun the next day, he would be extremely grateful to fate. This was because in the past 1,000,000 years, he had seen too many people who were stronger than him die because of a tiny mistake. They were completely torn apart and devoured by desolate beasts. The reason why he was able to occupy the highest position among humans in this world and control almost all of humanity's power with his mediocre strength was due to his outstanding intelligence and commanding ability that far surpassed the humans in this world by 1,000 levels. More importantly, he had the power to make other humans more powerful. After all, he was a half-pseudo-sage. Although he was restricted by this world, or rather, he was restricted by the giant tower and couldn't improve his strength. However, as a half-pseudo-sage, he still had the knowledge and perspective of a half-pseudo-sage cultivator. With this kind of knowledge and perspective, as long as he used it slightly, he would be able to see through everything about others. It was enough for him to know how others should cultivate and how to improve his own strength as quickly as possible. How should I complete this mission? Killing all of the dire beasts. Even if my power wasn't restricted, it would still be very difficult for me to complete this mission. Now, my power has been restricted to this level, and I have to complete this mission that would be very difficult for me to complete even if my power was at its peak. The pseudo-holy being recalled for a while, and a burst of resentment welled up from the bottom of his heart. It had been 1,000,000 years, and the number of cultivators he had nurtured numbered in the tens of millions, and the strongest among them had even reached the connate grand celestial realm. However, the situation in this world was not much different from the beginning. These desolate beasts still occupied the majority of the world. The humans in this world were still a weak race. They could only survive in the gaps between the many desolate beasts. Not to mention getting rid of the desolate beasts, even if they wanted to establish a foothold for humanity, it would still be difficult. Under such circumstances, the pseudo-sage cultivator could not help but feel despair. Of course, the most important thing was that the pseudo-saint was reaching the end of his lifespan. 1,000,000 years was simply too long for an existence that was only a few times stronger than an ordinary person. Even though this half-step pseudo-sage saint had used all sorts of means to prolong his lifespan, he had already reached his limit by using a small portion of his strength as tens of millions of portions or hundreds of millions of portions of his strength as tens of millions of portions. At this moment, he looked completely different from how he had been before. Back then, he only looked like a young man. Although his eyes were filled with endless wisdom and his temperament made him look extraordinary, he was still a young man. Back then, he looked like a young man. But now, he had completely turned into an old man, an incomparably old man. He looked like an ordinary old man who had lived from ancient times until now. His old appearance caused his reputation in this world to grow even greater. It made him even more trustworthy, but at the same time, it also made him feel even more despair. He did not know what kind of impact it would have on him if he died of old age. Would he fail the mission, would he reincarnate and continue the mission, or would his true body die of old age? The various possibilities caused the pressure in his heart to increase as time passed. The strongest desolate beasts in this world had even reached the pseudo-saint stage. If a powerhouse of this level really wanted to make a move, the entire world would not be enough to kill it. It could be said that the reason why this world could still maintain its current state and humans could still survive was because these powerful desolate beasts did not take humans seriously. They did not plan to destroy humans. It was also because of the existence of powerhouses among these desolate beasts that no matter how hard humans worked, no matter what methods and arrangements the pseudo-sage cultivator came up with, it would not be enough to complete his mission and completely clean up the desolate beasts in this world. It could even be predicted that even if this pseudo-sage cultivator had a lifespan of hundreds of millions of years, it would not be able to change this fact, let alone 1,000,000 years. After all, his true body was only at the pseudo-sage, and there was still an insurmountable gap between him and the pseudo-sage. Under such circumstances, he would not be of much help to the birth of a pseudo-saint existence among humans. In other words, even if he had a lifespan of hundreds of millions of years, even if all the humans in this world listened to his arrangements and guidance, it would still be difficult for him to truly nurture a pseudo-saint powerhouse in the end. And when humans without a pseudo-saint stage faced a desolate beast with a pseudo-saint, no matter how strong humans grew, even if they chased all the desolate beasts in this world to a certain corner to survive, they would not be able to truly clean up the desolate beasts and complete the mission of the pseudo-sage cultivator. Although this pseudo-sage cultivator was extremely desperate and worried, he could not violate the laws of nature. At the very least, he could not violate the laws of nature in this mission world. In the end, his death was still slowly approaching. Tens of thousands of years later, this pseudo-sage cultivator finally breathed his last in despair. At that moment, everyone in this world wailed in pain, and the powerhouses who had been guided by this pseudo-sage cultivator lost their minds one by one. Many of them even pounced into the nest of the desolate beasts and perished together with the desolate beast. After that, humans seemed to have lost their principles of action and fell into an indescribable chaos. For millions of years, all the actions and arrangements of the humans in this world had been made by the pseudo-sage cultivator. Even in the end, when the strength of the pseudo-sage cultivator had become insignificant compared to the true powerhouses of this world, he was still everyone's ideological mentor. All the arrangements, actions, and changes of humans were still made by him. Now that they had lost him, humans were like snakes that had lost their heads. While humans were in chaos, the pseudo-sage cultivator had fallen into a strange state. After dying of old age in this mission world, his mission did not fail, nor did he die. Instead, he reincarnated and became a desolate beast of this world. Could it be that my mission has become to destroy humans? The pseudo-sage cultivator muttered helplessly in a certain desolate beast's nest. His current body was that of an ape. Compared to other desolate beasts, he was more used to this appearance. At the very least, there was still a humanoid outline. At this moment, other than him, there were no other living beings in this nest. He didn't have any siblings in this life, and he didn't even have parents. On the second day of his birth, his parents met their natural enemy and died a violent death. It could be said that if he did not have the memories of his previous life, he would have starved to death by now. If it was to destroy humans, although he was against it, the mission would definitely be much easier. After all, there was not even a single pseudo-sage cultivator among humans. And among the desolate beasts, there were more than 10 pseudo-sage ones. As long as he slightly stimulated a pseudo-sage desolate beast and led it to attack humans, very soon humans would be completely extinct in this world. In that case, he would have completed the mission. However, unfortunately, his mission was still the same. He still needed to exterminate the desolate beasts. How could this be? I'm a desolate beast now. If I exterminate the desolate beasts, doesn't that mean I have to kill myself? The pseudo-sage cultivator was speechless. However, it was obvious that this mission world would not listen to his complaints, let alone change itself because of his wishes. Therefore, the mission was still the same mission. The requirements for him were still the same. Faced with such a situation, the pseudo-sage cultivator could only work hard obediently. Fortunately, as a desolate beast, it was much more convenient for him to do things. In the eyes of humans, all desolate beasts were their enemies. They were all existences that needed to be destroyed and killed. However, in reality, the desolate beasts were only a large species. Within the desolate beasts there were actually countless races. Between these races there was no harmony. Instead, there was a rather complicated relationship between them. For example, the race that the pseudo-sage cultivator reincarnated in this life had some natural enemies. Similarly, this race was also the natural enemy of some races. Under such circumstances, different desolate beasts would naturally have all sorts of battles and conflict. In fact, the battles and conflicts between them were even more serious than the battles and conflicts between desolate beasts and humans. It was even more tragic. After all, humans were only a minority race in this world. Their strength was weaker than any other desolate beast race, but not many desolate beasts would take humans seriously. Even if they were enemies, the desolate beasts would naturally not care too much about the races that they did not take seriously. Even killing was something that they did not take seriously. In other words, if they encountered them, they would not be stingy with killing them. However, if they did not encounter them, they would not take the initiative to look for or chase after them. For the pseudo-sage cultivator, reincarnating as a desolate beast was not all bad. In fact, the benefits of reincarnating as a desolate beast were much more than he had imagined. First of all, the greatest benefit was that the restrictions that this mission world had on his strength had disappeared, or rather, the restrictions on his body's strength had disappeared. Although he had only become a desolate beast for a few days, his strength had already increased by several times. He had reached a level where he could easily crush himself in his previous life. The feeling of breaking the shackles of strength and being able to improve himself once again was simply a shocking joy for this pseudo-sage cultivator. It even made him extremely grateful that this world had reincarnated him as a desolate beast. It went without saying how torturous it was for him to not be able to improve himself or sublimate himself for 1,000,000 years. If it was not for his high cultivation realm and tenacious heart, he might have committed suicide tens of thousands of times during those 1,000,000 years. Come on, since I've broken the shackles, I'll recover my strength as soon as possible. After making up his mind, the pseudo-sage cultivator began to cultivate with all his might in this lair. After entering a state of cultivation, he discovered that the shackles that time had on him had not completely disappeared. His heart and soul were still shackled by this world. They could only maintain their original state and could not improve. Right now, the only thing he could cultivate and improve was his body. After discovering this, the excitement in his heart lessened slightly. Naturally, his gratitude towards this world also lessened slightly. However, this situation was still much better than the previous situation where he was completely shackled. After all, he was not weak. Even if only his body could be improved, it was enough for him to do many things. In the next few years, he used various methods to refine his body as a desolate beast to the extreme, reaching the most perfect state. After that, he used the chi and blood of the desolate beast to break through the shackles of the race of the desolate beast. He completely refined his body, allowing it to become one with the world. In the end, he actually received a powerful feedback from the world. The body of the desolate beast that was originally like an ape instantly transformed into a human form. When his body transformed into human form, endless power descended and surged into his spirit, causing his spirit to grow tremendously in an instant. Although the essence of his spirit did not change, It was already many times stronger than before. Feeling this change, the pseudo-sage cultivator's heart jolted, and an inexplicable enlightenment appeared in his heart. As expected, as long as I refine my body, I'm no longer a desolate beast. Chapter 2396. There's a third race in this world? The pseudo-sage cultivator was filled with shock. It should be known that he had existed in this world for over 1,000,000 years. He had also been the human with the highest status in this world for hundreds of thousands of years. The breadth of his knowledge was self-evident. However, even so, he did not know that there was a third race in this world apart from wild beasts and humans before he achieved what he had today. At this moment, he felt that his eyes that had been blinded had been completely opened. There was suddenly another solution to the task that had made him feel hopeless. It was a solution that had a higher chance of success than before. Cleaning up the world and exterminating the wild beasts is not just a possibility of killing all the wild beasts. Turning all the wild beasts into a third race that doesn't belong to the wild beasts is also a solution. Countless thoughts and ideas emerged in the pseudo-sage cultivator's mind, causing his 3 eyes to gradually light up. After all, after spending so much effort and energy in this world for millions of years, he had finally found a chance to complete the task. How could he not be excited? How could he not be excited? That's right, it must be like this. This is the only way to complete this task. Very soon, the pseudo-sage cultivator had already convinced himself in the bottom of his heart. With this thought, the pseudo-sage cultivator's body shook slightly, and he returned to his original wild beast appearance. After the goal had changed, it was clearly more beneficial for him to complete the task if he maintained this wild beast appearance. After that, he directly left his lair and began to conquer the surrounding desolate beasts that were weaker than him. He either killed or subdued the surrounding desolate beasts. In just a few short months, he had already established a sizable faction in this mountain range and became the ruler of this territory. Because of his knowledge as a pseudo-sage cultivator, the strength of his wild beast body had long surpassed the limit of wild beasts and had directly risen to the innate grand heavenly realm. This level was naturally insignificant compared to the wild beasts in this world. However, compared to this mountain range, he could already be considered an invincible powerhouse. It was precisely because of this strength that he was able to subdue this mountain range so easily and turn the entire mountain range into his territory. As he became the ruler of this mountain range, he finally had the qualifications to carry out the plan he had prepared a few months ago. Then, he began to gather the wild beasts under him and began to teach them a lesson. And the content he was talking about was what he had previously figured out. It was the method to sublimate a desolate beast's bloodline and raise the essence of a desolate beast. Finally, it would surpass the essence of a desolate beast and become the third race in this world. Desolate beasts had varying levels of intelligence. The more intelligent ones were many times more intelligent than humans. However, they were still desolate beasts. On average, the intelligence of all desolate beasts could not compare to that of humans. Hence, this kind of communication naturally could not be like the communication with humans, where one could only use words to let the desolate beast understand one's own understanding. The half-pseudo-sage realm cultivator was well aware of this. In the process of raping, he had expended nearly all of his energy. At the same time, he had mobilized the chi and blood of the desolate beasts, driving their strength, allowing their bodies to follow his strength and his words to cultivate on their own. In comparison, his words were much less. Over the past few months, the half-pseudo-saint had already reorganized his previous cultivation method. Under such circumstances, although there were many types of desolate beasts under him and each of them had a different body, he still did not encounter any bottleneck. Under his control, the chi and blood of the desolate beasts began to increase, their bodies began to sublimate, and their essence began to gradually change. In the end, after 3 years of his cultivation, Most of his subordinates had already been sublimated and directly surpassed the essence of a desolate beast. From the integration with heaven and earth, they had obtained a body that was completely suitable for them and was similar to a human. With this change, the intelligence of these desolate beasts had also improved greatly. During this process, the desolate beasts felt as if they had opened their eyes to see the world for the first time. Finally, for the first time, they clearly understood their position in this world and the kindness that the half-pseudo-saint had shown them. Facing such a change, the half-pseudo-saint secretly rejoiced. He felt that there was a great chance of completing the task that he originally only had a little hope of completing. Through the 3 years of cultivation and teaching, he had already sorted out the cultivation method that could only be understood and not taught in word. It had become a complete and perfect cultivation system. At that moment, he directly said to the many desolate beasts, "I have comprehended the heaven and earth and comprehended our cultivation path. I dare not monopolize it, so I made a great wish to impart it to the world. I hope that all the desolate beasts can use this to break away from obscurity and sublimate. I hope that everyone can help me." Hearing such a righteous declaration, the living beings who were originally the subordinates of the half-pseudo-saint were naturally extremely supportive. All of them had changed from obedience to admiration for the half-pseudo-saint. They began to pat their chests, willing to shed blood and sacrifice everything for this great wish. Seeing this, the half-pseudo-saint was overjoyed. He completely imparted the cultivation method of the desolate beasts that he had sorted out and got his subordinates to go to various places in the world to spread the word and impart the cultivation system that he had created. Those newly born living beings were all filled with a sense of mission. After receiving the task, their fighting spirit was incomparably high. One by one, they left the mountain range with their heads held high and their chests puffed out. They went to places that they were familiar with or were completely unfamiliar with to impart this cultivation system. Their encounters were all different. Some were extremely miserable. They were directly mistaken for humans by the desolate beasts and were besieged to death. Some were smarter. They first transformed into the appearance of the desolate beasts, and after imparting the cultivation method to those living beings, they would transform back and save their own lives. However, in this state of stumbling, the cultivation system that the half-pseudo-saint had created became more and more popular. After all, it was to increase the strength of the desolate beasts. Even if the ultimate goal was to destroy the existence of the desolate beasts themselves would only gain benefits and no harm. As for whether the desolate beasts would die out or prosper, what meaning did it have to the desolate beasts themselves? Therefore, even if there were desolate beasts who could tell that they would no longer be desolate beasts after cultivating this cultivation method, none of them came to stop them. All the desolate beasts flocked to this cultivation system. Before the cultivation system was spread to where they were, they would take the initiative to come to these areas where the cultivation system was spread and take the initiative to learn it. With this change, in the next tens of thousands of years, this cultivation system had spread to most of the world. There was a third race that had never existed in this world before. As it became a true third race, there were even more of them than humans. This race was called the demon race. Once a desolate beast turned into a demon, the essence of its body would change. Their humanoid bodies had already turned into their true forms. Even if it could transform into the appearance of a desolate beast, it would only become a form of transformation. Therefore, the demon race gradually developed a natural sense of closeness towards humans. Their hostility towards humans also gradually decreased. After tens of thousands of years, the demon race and humans had become two forces that protected and helped each other. The reason for this was actually very simple. After all, humans were born with a human form, and they were born with the appearance of the demon race when they were born. Under such circumstances, the demon race would naturally think that humans were similar to them and would naturally feel a sense of closeness. Of course, even if they felt more closeness towards humans, they did not reject the desolate beasts too much. After all, compared to humans, the appearance of the desolate beasts and the demon race was almost completely different. However, the desolate beasts were the predecessors of the demon race. It could be said that they were their ancestors. Under such circumstances, how could the demon race reject the desolate beasts? It could be said that at this time, the demon race had already become the bridge of communication between humans and the desolate beasts, causing the conflict between humans and the desolate beasts to be greatly alleviated. Among the demon race, the half-saint had already become the ancestor. His status was so high that it was even higher than when he was still a human. One must know that he had fought for hundreds of thousands of years among humans to obtain such a high status. However, he had only been among the demon race for tens of thousands of years, and his status had already surpassed that of humans. This was a strange experience that made him feel like it was a lifetime ago when he occasionally thought about it. However, it was actually very normal for such a situation to happen. After all, among humans, the half-saint was originally just an ordinary person, and his status was essentially no different from anyone else. He wanted to continue climbing in this state of being equal to everyone, and finally stand above everyone and become a supreme existence. The resistance he encountered was self-evident. To be able to achieve this step in hundreds of thousands of years was already considered a brilliant method. However, in comparison, it was different among the demon race. First of all, he was the first demon race. He was the one who created the cultivation system of the demon race, and he was the one who led the demon race to be born from nothing. This situation was already enough for him to obtain an extremely high status, and he could even become an existence above all the other demons. Secondly, the demon race was born with a simpler mindset than humans. This seemed unbelievable, but it was actually very accurate. Although humans were naturally much weaker than the demon race, humans had developed for tens of thousands of years after all. The civilization among them was already extremely complicated and perfect. Any human, as long as they grew up in such a civilization, would naturally be dyed with the color of civilization and eventually become complicated. In comparison, the demon race was different. The demon race was born from nothing. Before the appearance of the half-saint, the demon race itself did not exist at all. In this way, there was naturally no so-called civilization. All the normal birth of the demon race could actually be considered to be carried out in a blank space. In this way, there were no traces of civilization in the demon race's mindset. Without the traces of civilization, they would naturally be even more simple. On the other hand, this simple mindset made their reverence even purer, and they spared no effort in promoting the half-saint. In this way, it was very normal for the half-saint to obtain his current status. After obtaining such a status, the half-saint did not relax, nor did he become complacent because of it. On the contrary, compared to when he had just created the cultivation system of the demon race, he was now more cautious. At the same time, his estimation of the future was no longer as optimistic. This was because he discovered that after tens of thousands of years of development, although the demon race had developed from nothing to the current situation where they were divided into three parts by humans and wild beasts. However, this seemed to have reached a certain bottleneck. The current number of the demon race seemed to have fallen into a stable state. The number of demons that could increase greatly at any time had unknowingly disappeared. If this were to continue, the various worlds would probably remain in such a state. Even if there were occasional fluctuations, it was just a matter of which side gained an advantage, and which side fell into a disadvantage. This was obviously against the half-saint's intention of completely exterminating the wild beasts. Why is the transformation of the wild beasts slowing down? It's obvious that all the wild beasts are willing to be transformed into demons, and none of them are stopping this transformation. The half-saint was full of doubts, and his mood became extremely gloomy. If there was a specific enemy in front of him, such as some wild beasts stopping the wild beasts from transforming into demons. No matter how strong the wild beasts were, he was confident that he could win and break the current bottleneck of the demon race's development. After all, this meant that the transformation of the wild beasts into demons was the general trend, and he was standing on the side of the general trend. As long as he worked hard, he would definitely be able to use the power of the general trend to break through all obstacles, push the general trend forward, and completely transform the wild beasts into demons. However, the current situation was completely different. Now, he couldn't find any enemy at all. Everything seemed to be normal, and everything seemed to be going smoothly. However, the final situation was stuck here. The number of wild beasts and the number of demons had unknowingly maintained an inexplicable balance. This situation where he couldn't find the problem at all, let alone the direction to exert his strength, made the half-saint feel aggrieved and at a loss. Vaguely, an indescribable worry emerged from the bottom of his heart. It can't be that this is the law of this world, right? If that's the case, wouldn't it be a waste to use this method to clean up the world? Chapter 2397. Just as this half-step pseudo-sage cultivator was having a headache over the situation of this mission world, an extremely subtle change suddenly occurred outside the giant tower. The creatures who were observing the providence suddenly discovered that the giant tower that had been eternally motionless suddenly had an additional providence that hadn't been there before. A providence that looked so strange but was extremely compatible with this world, as if it was a part of this world that had been missing for a long time, suddenly appeared above the giant tower out of thin air. Although this providence was extremely weak and insignificant, it attracted the attention of all the creatures who discovered this change, causing their moods to change drastically. Some became panicked, some became excited. All kinds of reactions showed how complicated the emotions of many creatures were. Why is there such a providence? What did they do in the giant tower? Some creatures who came out of the giant tower were extremely angry at the changes of the giant tower, and they began to roar loudly. These creatures had entered the giant tower before and completed the mission of the giant tower. After that, because they weren't used to the life inside the giant tower, they didn't enter the giant tower again after leaving it. Instead, they chose a place outside the giant tower to settle down and spread their Tao to benefit all living beings in this world. At this moment, the changes that happened to the giant tower made all of them feel a strong sense of crisis. "Teacher, why are you so angry? It's just an additional providence. What's the big deal?" Near one of the creatures who roared, a creature who was listening to this creature's words asked curiously. He was also his disciple. Evidently, he did not understand the creature's extreme reaction. After all, although the changes on the giant tower were novel, no matter how he looked at it, it was just a small change. It was enough to see something novel. Why was he so excited? It even felt like he was enraged and wanted to go crazy. Hearing this, the cultivator who came out of the giant tower said with an extremely ugly expression, "You guys haven't experienced the tribulation back then, so you don't know how dangerous it is. Although it's just a small amount of providence, it represents a new race. The appearance of a new race will definitely bring new competition. If this isn't handled well, it will set off an unimaginable war. At that time, it will be another round of tribulation that will destroy all living beings." Hearing this, one of his disciples exclaimed. Although none of these living beings had personally witnessed how terrifying the tribulations had been back then, none of them had witnessed it with their own eyes. However, the creature that came out of the giant pagoda had personally experienced it. During the process of imparting the Tao technique, he had used various methods to simulate the situation back then and explained it to the disciples countless times. Therefore, they knew very well how terrifying the previous tribulations were. How could they not be shocked and worried when they heard that the karmic luck that appeared in the giant tower could trigger a new tribulation? "What should we do?" Should we immediately go and wipe out the newly born race in that giant tower? A disciple exclaimed. Erase. The cultivator who came out from the tower frowned slightly. This method seemed to be quite useful, but it also had hidden dangers. After all, if he really took action, the final result might not be able to eliminate the danger. Instead, it might become the fuse of danger, the beginning of the conflict between the new race and the old race. However, these thoughts were quickly erased from the cultivator's mind. This was because he clearly knew that although he was not an extremely intelligent being, he was definitely not at the bottom of the cultivators. Although he could think of this, others might not necessarily be able to. At this moment, perhaps many cultivators had already taken action and directly went to the giant tower to wipe out the new owner of the karmic luck in the giant tower. In this way, no matter what choice he made, it would not change the final outcome of the matter. As for how the matter would develop in the end, it was no longer something he could decide. Immediately, he sighed and said, "It seems that I don't have to do it." The disciples were slightly stunned. Then, they all looked at the giant tower in shock. At this moment, the giant tower shone brightly. Streaks of light continuously rushed out from all over the world and crashed into the giant tower. It was clear that these were the cultivators who had entered the giant tower before and had been hiding outside the tower all this time. At this moment, they were obviously shocked by the new karmic luck that appeared in the giant tower and were ready to take action. Among them, there were definitely many who wanted to find the owner of the karmic luck and completely wipe it out. "I have to take action too." The cultivator sighed and stood up. He gave a few instructions to his disciples and told them to cultivate well. After that, he turned into a ray of light and flew toward the giant tower in the center. His cultivation realm was already at the quasi-sage stage. Although it was not considered too high in the giant tower, it was already a relatively high existence in this world. The speed of such an existence was enough to surpass most cultivators. Although he set off later, he was still the second batch to arrive at the giant tower. He was also the second batch to directly crash into the giant tower and return to the public space inside the giant tower. His departure left his disciples unable to react at all. After a long time, a disciple finally made up his mind. He turned into streaks of light and followed his teacher toward the giant tower. Clearly, this was an existence with a strong sense of responsibility and mission. It was all to follow their teacher into the giant tower and also deal with the karmic luck that appeared in the giant tower. Apart from such cultivators, there were also some who were relatively timid or did not dare to risk themselves and chose to stay where they were. They watched their companions burst out with astonishing courage and followed their teacher's footstep. "I really want to be as free as them." Some cultivators watched their companions leave and murmured. As for how much of it was true and how much was false, only they knew. This kind of thing happened everywhere in this world. It happened to most of the cultivators that came out of the giant tower. In just a few short days, the number of cultivators that had entered the giant tower had decreased by more than 90%. Only 10% of the cultivators remained in place due to various reasons and did not move. For a time, the situation of the entire world changed. A kind of chaos began to brew. After all, the cultivators that entered the giant tower were all powerhouses in this world. Even if such powerhouses did not have the intention to fight for hegemony, as long as they existed, they would naturally suppress a certain area around them. They would naturally become the protectors or even overlords of the area. Now that nearly 90% of such powerhouses had left, it was naturally equivalent to more than 90% of the areas that originally had protectors or overlords had lost their protectors or overlord. After losing their protectors and overlords, these areas naturally became juicy meat in the eyes of the surrounding areas. Being conquered and invaded was unavoidable. As a result, war was naturally inevitable. Now, the only thing that was left in suspense was the scale of the war. Would it be an all-out war for the entire world, or would it be limited to some areas? However, for the cultivators that had already entered the giant tower, none of this mattered. This was because compared to the situation outside, they were more concerned about the changes happening inside the giant tower. After entering the giant tower, these cultivators appeared in the public space. Moreover, they did not appear out of nowhere in the void of the public space like before. Instead, they appeared in the buildings. Back then, when the pseudo-sage cultivator changed the structure of this public space, he had already set the rules for this public space. Once a new cultivator entered this public space, the rules of this public space would naturally change, and they would naturally be assigned a room. Or rather, it was a small space. Based on the number of rooms in the public space, this situation could continue for a long time. Of course, even if the rooms in the public space were eventually used up, there was no need to worry. This was because the rules of the public space would naturally operate and create new buildings and rooms out of thin air. In this way, even if the number of cultivators in the public space increased by a few 100 million times, the public space would still be able to easily accommodate them. Moreover, the layout of the public space would not be changed, and the public space would not become crowded. This situation seemed inconceivable, as if it was impossible to happen. However, for the pseudo-sage cultivator, it could not be any easier. After all, cultivators had a different view of time and space compared to ordinary living beings. For cultivators, a place that could fit 10 rooms in an orderly manner could fit 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 rooms without a problem. In fact, the things that needed to be considered were about the same, and it would not be much more complicated in this way. If the public space could fit so many rooms, buildings, and living beings in an orderly manner, then it would be very easy for it to fit hundreds of thousands or even billions of times more. The cultivators who had just entered the giant tower obviously did not expect this change. At this moment, they all had strange expressions on their faces, and their hearts were filled with confusion. After a long while, they finally understood what was going on through the connection between them and this room, or rather, this small space that belonged to them, and the incredible changes that had happened in the public space. After understanding this, they suddenly felt inexplicably regretful. They regretted staying outside for too long and not seeing the entire process when the public space changed. After refining this small space according to the information transmitted by this room, these cultivators left their rooms one by one and began to carefully search for the source of the providence. After leaving their rooms, they were even more shocked by the changes in the public space. This was because the extremely crowded public space had unknowingly become empty. The towering skyscrapers stood between the heavens and the earth. At a glance, they looked like pillars, giving the public space a sense of stability. The streaks of light that flew between heaven and earth and the orderly plazas made them see a scene that was completely different from what they remembered, and they were all stunned for a long time. It's not just the private space that has changed, even the outside world has changed so much. Who did all of this? This was the doubt that appeared in the minds of many cultivators. The plazas all had different functions. Some of them could even be used to select mission spaces and even sell mission spaces. As for things like cultivation, deducing techniques, deducing abilities, trading, adventures, and entertainment, there was everything that one could think of. There was nothing that one could not think of. Compared to the cultivators who had just entered, who were filled with anxiety and worry, the cultivators who had been in the public space did not feel anything unusual at all. At this moment, they had already adapted to the changed public space, and their use of the plazas had reached a perfect state. At this moment, the many plazas were filled with a large number of cultivators and living beings. They were either communicating, trading, or simply having fun. All of these circumstances made the public space appear to be leisurely and cozy. It was no longer as tense and cramped as it was before. It felt like this was a brand new civilization, an existence attached to this giant tower, attached to the countless mission spaces, an incomparably perfect civilization with an incomparably high level. Even with the pressure of the brand new providence in their hearts, these cultivators could not help but be shocked by the specific changes in the public space, and they all admired the existence that had created this change. After a while, some of the more determined cultivators came back to their senses, and they began to search for the most powerful people in their knowledge. As for why they could still find the most powerful people in their knowledge in this completely unfamiliar place after the space had changed, there was no need to explain. Although the space had changed, their senses were not erased, and the auras of those powerful people were not concealed. If they wanted to find them, they only needed to sense their auras and confirm their auras, and they would be able to trace the source and find those powerful people. In this way, how difficult would it be to find those powerful people? Chapter 2398. In the end, almost every famous powerhouse in this public space was surrounded by a large number of cultivators who had come in from the outside. These cultivators could not help but be surprised that these unfamiliar cultivators, or cultivators that they had occasionally met before, suddenly gathered so enthusiastically. But what's going on? Why are all of you here together? A famous powerhouse asked. At this moment, this powerhouse was resting in a plaza that provided entertainment. Although he was not nervous when he was suddenly surrounded by so many unfamiliar cultivators, he still felt a little puzzled. Hearing this, those cultivators looked at each other. Although they had expected this, they could not help but be surprised when they saw that these powerhouses in this public space did not notice the appearance of the brand new luck. They became even more vigilant about the changes caused by this brand new luck. One must know that this kind of change was probably more difficult to deal with than they had imagined if even the existence of these powerhouses could be hidden. Immediately, a cultivator was pushed out by the crowd to share his discovery with this famous powerhouse. This famous powerhouse was already a pseudo-sage existence. Compared to pseudo-sages, desporators, and even supreme emperors, he was naturally nothing. However, in terms of absolute level, such an existence was already an extremely powerful existence. Once such an existence erupted, it would be a piece of cake for him to destroy the world. Hearing everyone's words, he could not help but turn pale with fright. How could he, as a famous powerhouse, not have thought of what other cultivators could think of? If he really could not think of it, he would not have become famous at all at this moment. He knew that the appearance of this unfamiliar luck represented the beginning of a drastic change to this giant tower and to the entire world. It meant that the next tribulation might descend. Damn it! Who the hell did this? A brand new luck. Someone has clearly created a new race that has been recognized by heaven and earth. He roared furiously, and the aura on his body began to be released in all directions endlessly. Although this public space was not absolutely safe, there were great restrictions on all kinds of destruction. In a normal world, this kind of aura was enough to knock a sage-to-be into a coma and kill even weaker existences. However, at this moment, in this public space, such a tremendous aura was continuously released, but it only attracted the attention of other living beings. It did not cause any damage to the public space, nor did it harm any living beings. Even living beings that were not immortals would only be shocked by this aura. They would not die from being enveloped by this aura. When that famed expert unleashed his aura, many famed experts in the distance also unleashed their powerful auras. These huge auras filled the entire public space, causing the originally leisurely and orderly public space to be shrouded by countless auras in an instant. It felt as if the public space had suddenly fallen into a storm. All of these powerful auras were at least at the pseudo-divinity realm. The strongest had even reached the pseudo-sage level. The sudden appearance of so many auras directly changed the order of the entire public space. Everyone in the public space knew that a drastic change had occurred in the eyes of ordinary cultivators. These famous experts were already the upper echelons of this world. They were the targets that they relied on. However, in reality, these famous experts knew that their positions in this world were not too high. Facing such a major event that involved the entire world, they did not really have the qualifications to participate, let alone make a decision. Obviously, after realizing this, these famous experts naturally had a target to refer to. In other words, they had a target that they relied on at this moment. After realizing the seriousness of the matter, the first thing they needed to look for was naturally the target that they relied on. Therefore, very soon, they directly bid farewell to the cultivators who came to tell them about this matter and directly soared into the sky, heading towards a certain place in this world where they believed that they could deal with this matter. In the end, the experts that they were looking for followed the experts that they could rely on. After repeating this a few times, all the experts gathered in front of one person. A person that was respected by everyone who knew him as the strongest expert. They believed that he had the qualifications to deal with anything in this world, any changes, and even a powerhouse that could rule the entire world. That person was Duan Shi. Fortunately, Duan Shi was in the public space at this time. Fortunately, he did not conceal his aura too tightly. Traces of his aura still leaked out, allowing some of the true experts in the public space to sense it. Duan Shi, Duan Shi. This allowed them to gather in front of him at this time and let him know what exactly was going on. If it was in the past, when he had just left the Supreme Alliance, he would definitely have been dismissive of the many cultivators' worries. After all, back then, he firmly believed in the results of his deduction and felt that there was no calamity in this world. Even if there were any twists and turns, he would definitely be able to deal with it easily in the end. However, it was clear that after experiencing the shocking calamity that almost destroyed the entire world, he knew that the results of his deductions were not reliable at all. It was still uncertain whether there was a calamity in this world or not. Perhaps what he deduced now was that there was no calamity in this world, and it would not take long for the entire world to fall into a shocking calamity that would eventually destroy everything. Under such circumstances, Duan Shi paid great attention to the information gathered by many other powerhouses. He frowned and floated into the air. The aura on his body began to gradually spread throughout the entire public space. He sensed all the details in the public space, and observed all the tiny structures contained in the public space in an attempt to find any possible clues. For ordinary cultivators, the restrictions in the public space were absolute. As long as the destructive power, perception, and other abilities exceeded the limits of the public space, they would be sealed and suppressed. However, for Duan Shi, who was already a supreme emperor, this was not the case. It wasn't easy for him to break through the shackles of the public space, but it wasn't easy at all. It was not impossible. Normally, he would not be so bored as to break through the shackles and restrictions of the public space. However, it was obvious that this was not a normal time. Instead, this was the time when the world was facing a hidden danger and a drastic change. Under such circumstances, no matter how strong the restrictions and shackles of the public space were, he would never give up. At this moment, facing such a change, the entire space began to tremble slowly. The originally calm and orderly appearance gradually changed. Dark clouds began to form in the sky, and they began to stir along Duan Shi's body, gradually forming an inexplicable vortex. Crackling sounds constantly rang out from inside and outside of Duan Shi's body. His body seemed to be bearing endless pressure in an instant. Even the space and time around his body seemed to be gradually distorted, unable to maintain its original calmness. As for the various rules and laws in the public space, they were also constantly trembling at this moment. It felt like they would completely collapse in the next moment, destroying the entire public space and making it completely useless. Under such circumstances, Duan Shi's senses were frantically transmitting, absorbing all the remaining information in the space and all the traces that might be related to the new providence into his senses as much as possible. He was doing the most thorough analysis. The providence appeared directly on the giant tower, so it was naturally related to everything inside the giant tower. Its appearance would inevitably trigger changes in everything inside the giant tower. And this public space was naturally inside the giant tower, so it was naturally within the scope of the changes. In this way, as long as he carefully sensed and studied the situation in the public space, he would be able to grasp the traces of the new providence. Very soon, Duansher found an abnormal trace. This trace was so obscure and weak. If he hadn't thoroughly sensed it under the restrictions and shackles of the public space, he wouldn't have been able to grasp this trace at all, let alone be sure that this trace was related to the new providence. It's him. When he discovered the trace, Duansher's expression instantly became extremely ugly. This was because he suddenly discovered that this new providence was most likely related to the one he saw in the past and felt that this providence was very special. It was related to the half-false saint that helped the public space obtain the current providence. Moreover, the relationship was probably quite close. This realization made him suddenly feel a little regretful. What he regretted was naturally not that he didn't erase the half-false saint back then, but that he clearly felt that the half-false saint was a little special, but he still didn't really pay attention to the half-false saint. He didn't further trace the source of the special providence, and didn't investigate the special influence of the providence before letting it go so easily. If he had spent some effort to trace, study, and explore back then, why would he have waited until the birth of the new providence and the new race to feel the abnormality? Perhaps at that moment, he would have discovered the abnormality, and even deduced to what extent things would develop in the end. He would know the most convenient and fastest way to solve this problem. However, this kind of regret only flashed in his heart for a moment. It was useless to keep being in a state of regret. Even if he regretted it so much that he wanted to commit suicide, things had already developed to this point. The most important thing at this time was not regret, but to work hard to find a way to solve this matter and this dangerous situation. Since he already knew that the new providence was related to the half-false saint, the solution to this matter was of course to start with the half-false saint. In order to achieve this goal, he first had to find the existence of the half-false saint. For an ordinary cultivator, this was an impossible task. After all, the half-false saint was currently in the mission world. On the other hand, the mission world was randomly created by this giant tower, and it could almost be said to be born and destroyed at will. If one wanted to determine the location of a certain mission world, unless the giant tower itself agreed or you also had to carry out the mission in that mission world, it was impossible at all. However, it was obvious that for Duansher, this kind of impossibility was not so absolute. After all, he was a supreme emperor, a powerful existence that had far surpassed despair. Although he wasn't truly supreme, that was only in the outside world. In this giant pagoda, he was already in that position, in such a state. The power of his mystical abilities was no longer something that ordinary cultivators, false sages, or even ordinary desperados could imagine. In addition, he was the first cultivator to enter this giant tower, and the first cultivator to complete the mission issued by this giant tower, so his understanding of the giant tower had long exceeded the imagination of all cultivators. Therefore, the impossible task of finding the mission world of a certain cultivator was no longer impossible for him. Even though this possibility was still not too high, the effort and energy that he would need to put in the end were beyond imagination. However, it was still possible. At this moment, Duansher closed his eyes, and a lot of information about this giant tower began to flow through his heart. It began to quickly decompose and reassemble, showing a path that could be regarded as a treasure in the eyes of other cultivators, revealing all kinds of profound secrets that ordinary cultivators could not imagine. During this process, he added the aura of the half-false saint that he had remembered into it. Using this aura as a guide, he began to deduce the various experiences of the owner of this aura in the past, and further deduce the location of the owner of this aura at this moment. As this deduction continued, the distortion of time and space around him became more and more intense. The terrifying pressure on his body also became stronger and stronger. Vaguely, a pitch-black cloud appeared above his head. It was faintly discernible, as if it could dissipate at any time, but it also seemed like it could suddenly condense and launch a boundless attack at any time. Duan Shi's expression did not change in the slightest in the face of the changes in the outside world. All sorts of complicated and mysterious information flashed through his mind without the slightest hesitation. All he did was continue to deduce, compare, and search. Chapter 2399. Duan Shi was naturally aware of the reactions of the many living beings below. However, he clearly did not have the energy to pay attention to them. At this moment, his heart was filled with the countless traces, lights, and sounds of the countless experiences. Through the deduction of the countless traces, lights, and sounds, an inexplicable vein began to gradually appear in his heart. This vein extended from the extremely distant past until it reached the present after extending for an unknown amount of time. It then suddenly split into countless tiny traces that continued to extend into the endless distant future. The past was eternal and unchanging. The future, on the other hand, was constantly changing and had countless possibilities. At this moment, what he saw was the countless possibilities that the vein had developed from the past to the future. It was not an easy task to fully grasp these countless possibilities. Even Duan Shi could only do it for a short period of time. He could not even think about doing it for hundreds of millions of years or trillions of years. However, even if he could only grasp all the futures in a short period of time, it was enough for him to use it at this moment. This was because, in just a few million years, he had already seen what he wanted to see. He had found the mission world where the pseudo-sage cultivator was at this moment. Furthermore, he had a vague idea of what the half-step pseudo-holiness had done. He actually created a new living being. Duan Shi murmured in his heart as his expression became rather ugly. Although he had seen many things, it was quite difficult to solve this problem. After all, the mission world was hidden in the giant tower. With the mysteriousness of the giant tower, it was almost impossible for even him to enter the mission world in the giant tower. If he could not enter the mission world, it would be even more difficult to go to the mission world and enter the mission world himself. In addition, the new luck had already appeared on the giant tower, which clearly meant that the newly born living being had obtained the giant tower's recognition. Even if he entered the mission world, it would be difficult to truly deal with these newly born living beings. If that was the case, it would obviously be extremely difficult to solve the current problem. No matter what, I'll have to get rid of this hidden danger. Duan Shi's expression turned determined as he thought of all the possibilities. His figure slowly descended, and in the blink of an eye, he returned to his original location. At this moment, the dark clouds in the sky had completely dissipated, and the pressure produced by the public space had also disappeared without a trace. As for the chaos of the original rules and laws, they had completely disappeared. It was as if nothing had happened, and everything remained the same as before. Did the Alliance Lord manage to find anything? A cultivator who was familiar with Duan Shi came forward and asked. Duan Shi nodded and said, "I roughly understand what's going on. A new type of creature had been born in the giant tower. It was a creature that was recognized by this giant tower, and even by the heavens and earth. According to my guess, this creature is very likely to challenge the position of the main character of the human world. If we let them grow, they will definitely fight us in the future." Hearing this, the expressions of the cultivators turned extremely ugly. Although they had guessed that the situation would be very troublesome, they still hoped to get lucky before they were completely sure. Now that they heard Duan Shi's words, their hopes of getting lucky finally vanished. It was replaced by an indescribable sense of solemnity and worry. The fight between the main characters of the world, could be said to be the most irreconcilable conflict between heaven and earth. Once such a battle broke out, the scope of the impact would definitely exceed all the predestined tribulations. At that instant, the minds of the cultivators who had experienced the previous calamity began to reverberate with the liquefied murderous intent that had completely enveloped heaven and earth in the past. Countless cries of agony, pain, and massacre appeared in their hearts out of nowhere, causing their faces to fill with determination. They had to stop the future from happening, even if it meant sacrificing their lives. The first batch of cultivators who had entered the giant tower had a certain level of consciousness. They were willing to give up their own interests for the sake of the peace of heaven and earth. When such existences knew that heaven and earth would most likely encounter such a great danger in the future, it was needless to say what they were thinking. Looking at the determination on the cultivators' faces, Duan Shi was very satisfied. Although these cultivators usually performed rather poorly, they were still willing to give it their all when danger really came. Immediately, he said, "We can't let such a future happen. Therefore, there's only one way now." "Kill them all," a cultivator said with a murderous voice. Hearing this, the other cultivators either frowned, showed a look of agreement, or looked like they could not bear to do it. Obviously, they did not agree with this suggestion. It was reasonable. It was just too cruel to completely wipe out a race, just because they knew that it might threaten the status of the main characters of heaven and earth. Hearing this, Duan Shi only shook his head indifferently. Before he could speak, another cultivator said, "Alliance Master, don't be soft-hearted. Although it's cruel to wipe them out, we have to do it for the future of mankind and heaven and earth. Moreover, even if we don't wipe them out now, when the battle between the main characters of heaven and earth really breaks out in the future, I'm afraid the number of humans who will die will be countless times more than the number of humans who exist now." His words made the cultivators who were originally reluctant to do it become determined again. Indeed, although it was too cruel to wipe out those seemingly innocent living beings, this was a battle between races and the main characters of heaven and earth. However, this was a battle between races, a battle between the protagonists of the world. If they didn't do this, they might seem to be preserving their mercy and sympathy, but what about the humans? What about the ignorant living beings in heaven and earth? When a full-scale war broke out in the future, the number of living beings who would die would only be more than what was being wiped out now. Moreover, most of those who would die might be their humans. That was not the only thing that was troublesome. More importantly, once a war broke out, there would be two possibilities. One was that humans would win, and the other was that humans would lose. If they won, then everything would be fine. Even if billions of humans died, they would still be able to maintain their position as the main characters of heaven and earth. They would still be able to occupy the fate of the main characters of heaven and earth, and continue to enjoy all the resources in heaven and earth. However, what if they failed? If they failed, then what awaited humans would be a second-class race. At that time, the fate of heaven and earth would be transferred to the newly born living beings. The resources that humans would obtain would be greatly reduced. Once it reached that stage, it would be the cruelest fate for humans compared to the final outcome. It was obviously the best choice to nip the danger in the bud and let the newly born race die out completely. After all, what they had to pay was just a little bit of sympathy and mercy from them. One by one, the cultivators quickly convinced themselves, and they turned their expectant gazes towards Duan Shi. They had even made up their minds that even if Duan Shi did not agree, they would take the initiative to wipe out that race. For the future of mankind. Seeing the changes in the cultivators' expressions, Duan Shi knew that if it wasn't for the fact that he was the only one who had information about the new race and knew how to search for the existence of the new race, they would have abandoned him and gone to the mission space to fight the new race. At that moment, he could only shake his head and say, "It's not that I sympathize with those living beings, but it's meaningless to do so. On the contrary, It will only make that race grow faster and bring forward the all-out war that might have happened in the distant future. Hearing this, the cultivators were slightly stunned. They did not expect that Duanshure's reason would be this. How is that possible? That race has just been born, so it's natural that it's relatively weak. There are so many of us and countless cultivators on the same path. Can't we completely wipe out that weak race? One of the cultivators said in disbelief. Hearing this, Duanshure said calmly, "You only see their weakness, but you don't see their potential. Don't forget how you found out about the existence of that race." The cultivators looked at each other in dismay. Their eyes were filled with confusion. After a while, one of the cultivators exclaimed, "It's fate!" This new race was brimming with vitality and destiny. This kind of fate is even more exuberant than the fate of the human race. That's why we're so cautious. The other cultivators' expressions changed drastically as they recalled the fact that they had neglected for a long time. Fate had a profound nature. It was karma, the favor of heaven and earth, and the accumulation of the world origin force. Almost every cultivator had their own understanding of fate, and they had their own opinions about the accumulation of fate. However, regardless of the cultivator or the Tao they cultivated, they all knew that the existence of fate was closely related to the existence of an individual. Generally speaking, as long as the fate existed, it was extremely difficult for the individual to fail and perish. It was the same for races. If a race's karmic luck wasn't destroyed, then even if all members of the race were completely wiped out, the race would still be able to rise from the ashes after a certain period of time and prosper again. Judging from the fate of the new race, it was obvious that the potential of the race was quite shocking. Moreover, judging from the vitality of the fate, if they wanted to extinguish the fate of the entire human race, it might not be enough even if they poured all the fate of the human race into it. In that case, even if they found the location of the new race and wiped out all the members of the new race would still be able to reappear after a certain period of time. It was as if they were born for the first time. At that time, the new race would definitely be filled with resentment toward the cultivators who had taken action. They would definitely be filled with resentment toward the race that they belonged to, which was the human race. This would obviously plant the seeds of hostility, causing the war between the two races that would have taken countless years to break out in advance. It seemed like a very long chain, but to the cultivators, it was a development that could be seen at a glance. It was an extension of the future that could be seen clearly at a glance. As a result, the cultivators all understood that it was impossible for them to completely wipe out that race. At the very least, it was impossible for them to achieve their goal. Then, what should we do? One of the cultivators mumbled. As he spoke, he looked at Duanshure with a look of confusion mixed with anticipation. The other cultivators also looked at Duanshure with similar gazes. It was obvious that they were at their wits' end, but they still wanted to receive guidance from Duanshure. Duanshure calmly said after being stared at by the cultivators, "The only way is to suppress the new race in this giant tower and make them help us carry out the task of the giant tower. We'll make them help us purify the giant tower and the karma that has gathered in the world." Many cultivators were shocked when they heard that. Their eyes shone brightly. It sounded like a great idea. Moreover, the possibility of execution was quite high. Those living beings would eventually compete with humans for the position of the main characters in the world. If that was the case, as long as they did not leave the giant tower and enter the wider world outside, everything would be fine. At that instant, many cultivators had countless ideas in their minds. Perhaps we can distort the worldview of those living beings and make them think that the world is only the world inside the giant tower, and that there is no world outside the giant tower. If that's the case, no matter how they explore and search, they can only stay inside the giant tower in the end. That way, the pressure they have on humans will naturally disappear. One of the cultivators murmured. As he spoke, his voice became louder and more excited. His expression was gradually filled with fanaticism. It was obvious that this idea made him feel inexplicably proud. When the other cultivators heard that, their eyes flickered as if there were countless lights flashing in the depths of their eyes. It was obvious that they also had many similar ideas because of this suggestion. Chapter 2400. Then, what should we do? A cultivator suddenly asked. These words caused many of the cultivators to fall into silence. What should they do? For the cultivators who couldn't even find a trace of the new race, and needed to rely on the era severing to figure out where the danger was, how could they think of a way to completely restrict the new race in this giant tower? At this time, they were looking forward to other people coming up with useful suggestions that could help them succeed instead of just talking about it on paper. Unfortunately, the silence lasted for a long time. No one answered the question. In this way, everyone's gazes could only be directed at Duan Shi, who was standing to the side. If there was anyone here who could come up with a way to complete their plan, it would be Duan Shi, the former leader of the Supreme Alliance. Duan Shi's mood did not fluctuate at all under everyone's gaze. He had already expected that these cultivators could only talk on paper. Asking them to come up with a solution was simply wishful thinking. However, the reaction of the crowd only confirmed his original thoughts. Immediately, he said calmly, "We'll talk about the specific method later. The most important thing now is to find them." Hearing this, many cultivators were disappointed. In their hearts, they were hoping that Duan Shi would immediately give them an answer when they had doubts. Right now, they wanted to make it impossible for the new race to leave the giant tower, but they hoped that Duan Shi would immediately come up with a feasible solution. As a result, although what Duan Shi said was very normal, they were still somewhat disappointed. Duan Shi was still unmoved by the changes in the crowd's expression. At that moment, he only called out the names of the cultivators one by one and assigned tasks to each of them. Some of these tasks only required the cultivators to complete on their own, but some required the cultivators to use their connections and seek help from other cultivators to complete them. In the end, all the cultivators had to work together, but almost all the cultivators in this public space had to be mobilized in order to complete the whole plan. Although the cultivators were a little disappointed with Duan Shi, they knew that his current arrangement was the most appropriate one. Therefore, none of the cultivators dared to slack off in the slightest. After receiving the instructions, they immediately agreed to it. One by one, they went off to complete the tasks assigned to them by Duan Shi. It did not take long before there were no more cultivators around Duan Shi. The only one left was Duan Shi, who was mobilizing his power to send out wave after wave of runes into his surroundings. The runes then fused with the surrounding space. After all, this matter concerned the life and death of the entire human race. They had to make use of all possible forces. Of course, he couldn't just arrange things and wait there without doing anything. Very soon, there were billions of runes densely piled up around his body, faintly forming a broken and wondrous formation. At the same time, almost all the ranked cultivators in the public space began to move. They began to make various arrangements in the public space, releasing various kinds of power, either into the void, into the buildings, or directly attaching themselves to the cultivators. There were all kinds of strange things, causing the public space to undergo earth-shattering changes in just a short period of time. During the process, the public space would occasionally shake. Some kind of pressure would appear out of nowhere, acting on the cultivators who were constantly taking action in the public space. The cultivators trembled in fear during the process, constantly worried that the public space would suddenly release all its power and bombard them. However, things did not develop to the worst outcome. By the time all the cultivators were done with their work, the entire public space had been enveloped by endless and constantly changing runes. However, the public space was still releasing an indescribable pressure on them. In the end, it did not really explode and cause them any harm. Duan Shi floated in the void. The runes around him were the densest in the entire public space. He was also the center of all the runes in the public space, the hub. At this time, the runes that he had set up were still separated from the preparations that the other cultivators had made. In other words, they were still in a state of independence. This clearly did not conform to his plan. He would not be able to achieve the goal that he originally wanted to achieve. Hence, what he needed to do now was not to carry out his original plan of searching for the place where those living beings were and communicate with the worlds of those newly born living beings. Instead, he needed to link the countless runes all over the public space into one. Looking at the endless runes, Duan Shi took a deep breath and gritted his teeth. Endless power burst out of his body and directly poured into the billions of runes that he had set up around him. As the power he released merged into the runes, the billions of runes began to jump one by one. Intense light began to radiate from the runes that were enveloped by his power. The light began to spread in all directions, lighting up more and more runes in the surroundings, causing them to also emit light. Soon, all the runes that he had set up were enveloped by the light, making it seem like there was an extra sun around him. It began to release endless light and heat. As time passed, the light became brighter and more dazzling. In the end, after rising to a certain level, the light seemed to break through some invisible obstacles and directly rushed into the many runes that the other cultivators had set up, lighting up those runes continuously. Compared to the runes that Duan Shi had set up himself, the runes that the other cultivators had set up were far inferior in terms of quality and quantity. The time that the runes could last under the light was also much shorter than the runes that he had set up himself. Therefore, in just a few breaths, the area that he had lit up had expanded to more than 10 times the area that he was responsible for. During this process, the light encountered dozens of invisible obstructions. However, in the face of these dozens of obstructions, these rays of light did not slow down even a little. It was as if there were dozens of small slopes in front of them, and they easily flowed over. At the very most, they only paused for a little bit in the process. The eyes of many cultivators in the public space were filled with anticipation. One had to know that the current state of this public space was partly due to their contributions. Naturally, they were eager to know the results of their efforts and how it would develop in the end. The light didn't move according to their will. Like a tidal wave, it frantically spread in all directions. In just half an hour, it had already spread to the entire public space, enveloping all the plazas, buildings, roads, and even space-time in the public space. As the light shrouded the area, the countless runes seemed to have come to life and began to move quickly, using the entire public space as a stage. As it moved, all kinds of indescribable power began to be produced and began to move around the public space along with the whole body formed by the countless runes. As it moved, the originally extremely clear runes began to become blurrier and more obscure. In the end, when the light that covered the entire public space gradually disappeared, the countless runes that covered the entire public space also disappeared completely. The entire public space seemed to have returned to how it was before the many cultivators worked hard, as if nothing had happened and nothing had changed. Faced with such a situation, many cultivators were dumbfounded. They had no idea what had happened at all. Did he fail? Some cultivators even began to doubt in their hearts. After all, the situation in front of them was too strange. With their perception and vision, they could not see any difference between the public space and before. How could they not suspect that all the hard work they had put in just now was for naught? Some of the cultivators reacted quickly and cast their gazes at Duan Shi, who was hovering in the void. The moment they saw Duan Shi, the doubts in the hearts of those cultivators disappeared completely. The buzzing sounds of discussion that reverberated in the entire public space had unknowingly disappeared. This was because at that moment, there was an endless amount of information flashing in Duan Shi's eyes. The amount of information was so great that even the strongest cultivators would feel dizzy just by looking at it. As for those who weren't strong enough but could see Duan Shi's gaze, They couldn't withstand the flow of information and fainted in an instant. They completely lost consciousness. In such a situation, it was obvious that Duan Shi was investigating something. Something that had never happened before had actually appeared at this moment. This clearly indicated that their previous efforts had not been in vain. The runic array was already showing its effect. It's spreading. After a long time, Duan Shi focused his gaze on a spot in the public space and sighed. Just now, he had used the rune formation to analyze the traces of the countless mission spaces that were connected to the public space. The result of this analysis made him feel helpless. This was because, according to his analysis, the newly born race had already broken through the barrier of a certain mission world and had begun to spread among the mission worlds. In other words, there was originally only one mission space with the newly born race. But now it was no longer just one mission space. Several other public spaces had given birth to the new race out of thin air. This situation made his original plan to restrict these races many times more troublesome. However, with this discovery, he understood that he did not have the right to continue delaying at the moment. He had to come up with a plan as soon as possible. Otherwise, if he waited any longer and the creatures continued to spread, it would become even more difficult to deal with. At that moment, he had a thought and the entire public space began to shake violently. Dark clouds began to gather in the sky and endless pressure began to appear out of thin air, pressing down on Duan Shi's body. Duan Shi's actions had obviously shaken the foundation of the public space, so it triggered an intense reaction from the public space. Facing this pressure, Duan Shi's expression did not change at all. He continued to activate the many runes that he had set up just now, constantly shaking the entire public space and changing the rules of the public space. During this process, runes kept flashing in the void. It seemed like the entire public space was completely constructed by these runes. At this time, chaos had begun to appear everywhere, revealing the original foundation of the space. Although all the cultivators had no idea what Duan Shi was doing, they could not help but feel nervous. Even if they could not understand what was going on, they knew that what Duan Shi was doing was extremely important. Finally, at a certain moment, Duan Shi roared, "Open!" As he roared, endless thunderclaps exploded. Then, countless lightning bolts erupted from the dark clouds that had gathered in the void above Duan Shi's head and struck down at him. In the blink of an eye, Duan Shi's entire body was wrapped in countless lightning bolts. The lightning bolts were so terrifying that other cultivators, even false saints, would feel their consciousness sinking and their bodies collapsing as soon as they sensed it. At this time, Duan Shi did not flinch even though he was surrounded by countless lightning bolts. It was as if the lightning bolts were just ordinary lightning bolts. As he moved, the countless runes gathered at the spot he had been staring at before and began to gather into pillars of light there. These pillars of light towered from the ground all the way to the sky, reaching up to the sky. These pillars of light were white in color. From them, one could feel an indescribable majesty and an unimaginably transcendent aura. Anyone who sensed the existence of these pillars of light could clearly feel that everything they had was incomparably insignificant in front of these pillars of light. At this time, the public space seemed to be extremely enraged. The entire space continued to shake. The dark clouds in the sky continued to gather and strengthen. The lightning bolts that struck down were also getting stronger. From the thickness of an arm, they gradually grew to the thickness of a bucket. They struck at Duan Shi in a frenzy as if they could not wait to wipe him out immediately.